It's Labor Day weekend, 1968. Indianapolis Raceway Park is absolutely packed. The greatest drag race in the world is happening right now, and somewhere in that paddock, buried between the big haulers and the factory-back teams with their crew chiefs and their matching uniforms and their corporate checkbooks, there is one single man standing next to a lime green 1932 Ford 5-window coupe. No crew. No sponsor. No factory backing. Just a guy from Monroeville, Pennsylvania, who bought this car out of a junkyard for $400, built the engine himself, fabricated the transmission himself, tuned the car himself, and is about to drive it himself to one of the most celebrated wins in the entire history of the NHRA Nationals. And here's the thing that makes all of that even better. During every single time trial run that weekend, this man deliberately fouled. He red-lighted on purpose, every single pass, because he knew the old timing systems didn't display reaction times, and he was using those runs to silently calibrate his launch timing for when eliminations actually started. Nobody else figured that out. He just quietly sat there building his own advantage, while every other competitor was chasing fast time slip. That is the kind of thinker we are talking about today. A man who took a junkyard Ford, a small block Chevy and a garage behind a highway motel, and beat the entire field at Indianapolis. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about grassroots racing legends and the forgotten machines that should have been in every magazine ever printed. If you're someone who loves the raw, unfiltered history of American drag racing, the kind of story where one guy with grease under his fingernails outsmarts an entire sport, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Because today we are going deep on Harry Luzader, the classical gas 32 Ford, and one of the most remarkable privateer stories the drag strip world has ever produced. So let's go back to the very beginning. And when I say beginning, I mean a junkyard in Monroeville, Pennsylvania, sometime around 1958. A rusted 1932 Ford 5-window coupe is sitting there next to another derelict 32, and both of them are going absolutely nowhere fast. Harry's family owned the 22 Motel at 3636 William Penn Highway. 40 units, right on the main drag east of Pittsburgh. His parents bought it in 1950, and it became the family business. And then Harry's father died while Harry was still a teenager. Suddenly this kid is helping his widowed mother run a motel while his friends are out doing whatever teenagers do in western Pennsylvania in the late 50s. His mother had a 6-bay garage built behind the property. Whether she knew what she was setting in motion with that decision is unclear, but those 6 bays became the nerve center of one of the most successful privateer drag racing operations on the entire East Coast for the next 2.5 decades. Before the 32 Ford, Harry and his brother had been wrenching on a 1938 Ford in a rented garage across town, doing what kids did back then, which was terrorizing the local street racing scene after dark on the highway. The passion for fast cars was already burning. What changed everything was that 32 Ford sitting in the junkyard that Harry could literally see from the family property. The junkyard caretaker was, by all accounts, an interesting character. The kind of person who is very attached to things that other people would consider absolute garbage. Getting that car loose took months of negotiations. But Harry eventually put $400 cash in that man's hand and pushed the deuce home. It had a Model A 4-cylinder in it. A flathead 4, the cheaper engine the original owner had ordered back in 1932, and the caretaker had apparently driven it until it expired around 1958 and then just parked it. So Harry was starting with a completely dead stalker with roughly 26 years of accumulated neglect sitting on top of it. Now, you have to understand what a 1932 Ford meant in hot rod culture to fully appreciate why Harry even wanted this thing. The 1932 Ford is the foundational American hot rod. The deuce. The Holy Grail, as people in that community literally call it. The proportions are right. The chassis is adaptable. The body style is absolutely iconic. By the late 50s and early 60s, if you were building a serious hot rod, there was a very strong chance it started life as a 32 Ford. When Harry looked at that junker through the chain-link fence, he was not just seeing a cheap car. He was seeing the thing. He got it finished and road-ready by 1962. The first engine was a 352-inch stroker small-block Chevy, where the crankshaft had been modified through welding to increase displacement and torque. But a welded crank is a time bomb. You know it will eventually let go. You just never know exactly when. Harry got connected to the right people early. A local machine shop owner named Don Balland did the precision machine work and introduced Harry to Dave Koffel, a legendary Ohio gas racer who genuinely understood how to make a Chevy run. Koffel's advice was blunt. The motor is fast, but do not push that welded crank too hard because it will let go. And sure enough, it eventually let go in spectacular fashion, destroying itself completely. Most people in that situation would have simply rebuilt the stroker and kept going. Harry went a completely different direction. And here is where the technical story gets really interesting, because the decision Harry made after losing that first engine is basically the foundation of everything that followed. Instead of building another big-inch stroker, he went small. Really small by gasser standards. He took a 283 cubic inch Chevy small block, which is a fairly humble piece of iron, and bored it 60 thousandths over to bring it out to 292 cubic inches. And then he topped it with a Hilborn fuel injection unit. Now, here is what most people don't realize about that choice. Hilborn injection was not supercharging, and that distinction matters enormously. The famous A-gas supercharged gassers, the ones everybody talks about when they mention the gasser wars, were running massive blown Chrysler Hemis and Chevy big blocks with belt-driven roots, superchargers stuffing air into engines displacing 427 cubic inches or more. Those cars were making somewhere in the range of 800 to 1,000 horsepower and running the quarter mile in the nines by the mid-60s. Harry's car was nowhere near that category and was never supposed to be. The Hilborn injector on a naturally aspirated engine is a mechanical fuel injection system that meters fuel very precisely based on throttle position and airflow. It is more efficient than carburetors at high RPM. It responds better under hard acceleration. But it is not forcing extra air into the engine the way a supercharger does. What it does is ensure fuel delivery is absolutely perfect all the time, which means you can run the engine harder and extract every last bit of power from whatever displacement you have. The real magic came from the valve train. Through his connection to Don Balland, Harry got introduced to Harvey Crane of Crane Cams down in Hallandale, Florida. Harvey Crane was a serious, respected figure in the cam grinding world and eventually an East Coast Drag Times Hall of Fame member himself, which tells you something significant about the caliber of people inside Harry's network, even if his operation looked like a one-man band on the surface. Crane supplied a roller camshaft along with ported cylinder heads and a complete valve train package specifically designed to extract maximum power at very high RPM. That combination allowed the 292-inch engine to pull reliably to 8,900 revolutions per minute. And reliable is the critical word there, because a lot of engines can make big power for a handful of passes. But Harry was going to make thousands of passes over this car's career, and the engine had to survive every single one of them. The 4-speed transmission he built himself by hand in the garage behind the motel. And the reason I keep returning to that detail is because it keeps getting more impressive the longer you think about it. A 4-speed manual transmission is not a simple piece of machinery. The gear sets, the synchronizers, the shift forks, the case itself, everything has to be machined to close tolerances and assembled correctly or it grenades violently on a racetrack. Harry fabricated his own from scratch. So what you had in this lime green 32 Ford by the time it entered NHRA competition around 1963 was a completely hand-built race car. Every significant mechanical component had been built, assembled or personally modified by one person working in a 6-bay garage behind a family motel in suburban Pittsburgh. The car entered C-gas initially, which placed it in a class determined by total vehicle weight divided by engine displacement. C-gas in the mid-60s ran roughly 10.50 to 11.49 pounds per cubic inch. At 292 cubic inches, Harry's car had to weigh at least around 3,066 pounds to qualify. As the car accumulated winnings and Harry added ballast strategically over time, he eventually moved down to D-gas and later E-gas, where he found his greatest success in the pure gas class format. Then NHRA expanded its altered classifications and Harry moved to D-altered within Competition Eliminator, which operated under a completely different format where cars from different classes run against each other on a lapse time handicap. D-altered at 11 pounds per cubic inch meant the car was indexed at roughly 3,212 pounds. Competition Eliminator was where the Nationals title would eventually come from. Now, you might be thinking, look, this is just one guy at one regional track running a car most people have never heard of. But here is what most people don't realize. Harry's home track was Pittsburgh International Dragway, built on a former airport site in the Bridgeville area off Route 50. He also ran at Maple Grove in Pennsylvania, York US 30 Dragway, Englishtown in New Jersey, and Gainesville in Florida. And of course, Indianapolis. The car's reputation on the East Coast Division I circuit built steadily through the mid-60s. It won in C-gas. It won in Street Eliminator. It won in D-gas. And it had a signature that fans started recognizing immediately. The thing wheel stood. Not just off the line, but through every gear change, through the entire quarter mile. That lightweight front end on a drop-tube axle with a chrome leaf spring setup, combined with all the weight biased hard toward the rear and the snappy power delivery of a high-revving small block, meant the car came up off its front wheels and stayed up. People started expecting it. Jim Hill, who later wrote the definitive piece on Harry's career, described it perfectly as a high-riding mint green deuce 5-window tearing across the track, pulling the front wheels in every gear. That image stuck in people's heads permanently. By the time Harry added the polished aluminum front-mounted Moon fuel tank, which is a classic gasser styling element, the car had the complete visual package. Chrome straight axle up front, jacked nose high, a Moon tank gleaming in the sun, lime green body, and those front wheels coming up every single time the car launched. That combination was genuinely impossible to forget. Now let's talk about what was happening around Harry during this period, because context matters here in a way that changes everything about how you understand his achievement. When people talk about the gasser wars, they are mostly talking about the A-gas supercharged class. And they are mostly talking about Ohio George Montgomery, and Stone Woods and Cook, and Big John Mazmanian. These are the names that ended up in the history books, and they deserve to be there, because those cars and those teams did something genuinely extraordinary. Ohio George won Little Eliminator at 3 consecutive NHRA Nationals from 1959 to 1961 in his powder blue 1933 Willis, and went on to win 4 total Eliminator titles at Indy over his career. Stone Woods and Cook ran an integrated team out of Los Angeles with a 1941 Willis on a blown Chrysler Hemi and were voted the fans' favorite race car of all time in a 2008 NHRA poll. Big John Mazmanian put his candy red 1941 Willis into the nines for the first time at Bakersfield in March of 1964, running a 9.77, and that was a genuine landmark moment. These were touring professionals. They were backed by cam manufacturers. Isky sponsored Stone Woods and Cook. Engel backed Mazmanian. The advertising wars between those companies fueled the on-track rivalries, and track promoters traveled to the NHRA Nationals specifically to sign match race contracts with these teams. They were running 6 to 10 match races per month, crisscrossing the country constantly. Harry Luzader was not any of that. Harry was competing in the middle-tier gas classes at NHRA Division I events against other serious but largely regional racers. The competitive fields in D-gas and E-gas were deep. The margins were small. Winning consistently there with a hand-built one-man program is genuinely difficult even when nobody is writing magazine features about it. The other thing worth understanding is that by the mid-60s, the 1932 Ford body was already carrying a disadvantage in the upper classes. The Willis Coupes, the 1933 and 1940 to 41 models, weighed between 1,500 and 1,800 pounds in race trim. The Ford Anglia was lighter still. The 32 Ford with its full steel body ran closer to 2,100 to 2,400 pounds, and its 106-inch wheelbase was longer than either the Willis or the Anglia, which affected weight transfer dynamics significantly. For the highest class competition, those differences mattered enormously. But in the middle classes where Harry was operating, the 32 Ford's iconic status and Harry's exceptional engine building kept things very, very competitive. And unlike the match race stars who were collecting real money from track promoters, Harry's entire program was funded by NHRA class winnings. Whatever the car earned at the track paid for the car to get to the next track. That financial discipline forced an efficiency that most teams with outside money never had to develop. By 1967 and 1968, Harry was running the 32 in de-altered under the competition eliminator format, and the comp eliminator bracket is where things get complicated in an interesting way. Competition eliminator takes cars from every altered and gas class across the entire program and runs them against each other using elapsed time handicaps based on each car's national record for its class. So Harry's 32 running de-altered might be bracketed against a car from B-altered or E-altered or any other class in the field. The Christmas tree gives the slower car a head start based on the difference in their class indexes. The fastest car does not necessarily win. The car that runs closest to its class index wins. This format rewards consistency and precision above raw speed. You have to know exactly what your car is going to run, and then you have to make it run exactly that. No more, no less. And the guy who had been building and tuning this engine by himself for 5 straight years had a very precise understanding of what his car was going to do on any given pass. At the 1968 NHRA Spring Nationals at Englishtown, Harry won Best Engineered Honors, an award that specifically recognizes the quality and sophistication of the mechanical package. Coming from a one-man operation, that recognition is a significant statement about what he had built. A period photograph shows the lime green 32 leaving hard against the Blackwood Herdkirk altered Anglia, which was a 426 Hemi-powered machine, with NHRA Chief Starter Buster Couch running the Christmas tree. The competition Harry was facing in eliminations was not soft. Then came Labor Day weekend in Indianapolis. The NHRA U.S. Nationals at Indianapolis Raceway Park was then, and arguably still, is the most important drag race in the entire country. It is the biggest field, the deepest competition, the most scrutiny. Winning anything at Indianapolis means something real. And Harry showed up alone with his 292-inch small block built on a machine stand in a 6-bay garage behind a motel on a Pennsylvania highway. And he started deliberately red lighting in time trials. Here is where it gets really interesting because this is genuinely one of the smartest pieces of racecraft you will ever hear described. The timing equipment at Indianapolis Raceway Park in 1968 did not display reaction times at the finish line or on-time slips the way modern systems do. Harry knew this going in. So he used his time trial passes not to chase a fast elapsed time but to calibrate his launch timing with complete precision. Every red light was a data point. How early was I exactly? What does that feel like physically? Adjust. Run again. Red light again. Adjust again. By the time eliminations began, he knew with absolute certainty what it felt like to get right on the green light and deliver it consistently under pressure. and he delivered right on green starts all the way through the bracket, all the way to the final. The final round of competition eliminator put Harry against Carl Kirk, who drove for the Blackwood Herdkirk team. Drag Racing Central's retrospective on the event noted it was a very popular win with the fans, and that Kirk did not make another final round in his career after losing this one. Competition Plus confirmed it in period reporting. A classic 32 Ford Deuce Coupe captured competition eliminator laurels, driven by Harry Luzader of Monroeville. The following year's official NHRA Nationals program listed him among the 1968 champions alongside Don Garlitz in Top Fuel and a handful of others across the eliminators. Harry Luzader. One man. A $400 junkyard car. A Wally Trophy from Indianapolis. Over the full career of that 32 Ford from roughly 1963 to 1973, Harry accumulated over a dozen NHRA elapsed time and miles per hour class records in D-Gas and E-Gas. He took 17 national class win trophies. He won approximately a dozen Division I World Championship Series events. He led the Division I point standings for 4 consecutive years. The car made an estimated several thousand passes during that decade, which is an enormous number for any single race car, especially one being loaded on a trailer and driven to tracks across the entire eastern seaboard by its builder, driver, and tuner. One important thing I have to flag here, because this channel does not paper over gaps in the historical record. No source I could find anywhere lists specific elapsed times or trap speeds for Harry's car in any class configuration. The record clearly states he held over a dozen NHRA elapsed time and miles per hour class records, and I have absolutely no reason to doubt that. But nobody appears to have written down the actual numbers in any document that is publicly accessible today. The NHRA archives at their museum in Pomona would almost certainly have the actual class records from that era, and that is precisely where you would need to go to find them. If you dig those up, I genuinely want to know what they were. Leave it in the comments. Also worth addressing directly is the name Classical Gas. The definitive article about Harry's career on the East Coast Drag Times Hall of Fame website is titled Rust to Diamonds: The Long Journey of Harry Luzader's Classical Gas 32 Ford. That is where the name comes from. But whether Classical Gas was actually lettered on the body of the car or was simply the author Jim Hill's creative headline choice, I could not confirm from any photograph or source I found. Period photos of the car exist, and they show the lime green coupe in real detail, but the resolution and angles available online did not allow me to read any lettering definitively. So call it Classical Gas if you want, but I am hedging on whether that was the car's official name or simply a great article title. The end of the 32 Ford as a race car came in 1973, and it was a decision Harry later described as one he often regretted. By the early 70s, aerodynamics had become a serious competitive factor in gasser class competition. The NHRA rules had been evolving steadily, and the cars beating Harry in the altered classes were getting sleeker and more purpose-built. The 32 Ford, with its upright windshield and vertical body panels and essentially flat front face, was, as Jim Hill put it, a quarter-mile windjammer. Beautiful to look at and aerodynamically punishing at the speeds Harry was reaching. Adding ballast and running a smaller class could only compensate so much for a body style designed in 1932 with zero consideration for aerodynamic. So in 1973, Harry sold the car he had built and campaigned for a full decade to fund the construction of a 1969 Opel GT race car. The Opel GT is a significantly more aerodynamically efficient shape, and Harry put the same basic engine philosophy into it. A 292-inch injected small block Chevy with a crane roller cam package. The Opel eventually pulled to 9,500 revolutions per minute with a fluid damper harmonic balancer added to protect the crankshaft. He raced that car in E-Gas and de-altered through Modified Eliminator and Competition Eliminator until 1981, when NHRA dropped Modified Eliminator entirely. He then continued in Comp until around 1990, when the costs finally exceeded what he could sustain on a privateer budget. 9 years of NASCAR circle track racing also mixed into the later years before he fully stepped away from competition. In 1982, Harry and his wife Carol opened Luzader Auto Parts and Service at 274 Center Road in Monroeville in a former BP gas station. They ran that business together for 4 decades. A 2021 profile in Trib Live described Harry at 77, still working alongside Carol. They retired in early 2023. No obituary has been found as of the time this script was researched, which is genuinely good news, because it suggests Harry Luzader is still out there somewhere in Monroeville at roughly 81 or 82 years old. And that matters for reasons we are about to get into. In 2007, Ford Motor Company named Harry's 32 one of the 75 most significant 1932 Ford hot rods of all time as part of the Deuce's 75th anniversary celebration. A blue ribbon selection panel that included Jeff Beck, Greg Sharp, Pete Shapuris, and Jake Jacobs evaluated 474 nominees and chose 75. Harry's lime green competition eliminator winner from a Pennsylvania junkyard was one of them. Now, Jeff Beck, for anyone who does not immediately recognize that name in this context, was not simply a selector for a car show. Jeff Beck was one of the greatest guitarists who ever lived, and he was also a genuine, lifelong, deeply obsessive collector of 1932 Ford hot rod. He owned multiple Deuces. He commissioned custom builds. He was the kind of collector who did not just buy things. He understood them at a level most people never reach. And Jeff Beck wanted Harry Luzader's car. According to the East Coast Drag Times Hall of Fame piece, Beck offered substantial money for the 32 and was turned down flat. A commenter on Haggerty Media's tribute piece after Beck passed away in January 2023 also referenced attempts to acquire the car dating back years from multiple serious buyers. The current owner, whoever that person is, bought the car in 1973 when Harry sold it, converted it from a race car to a street rod, and as of the most recent reporting available, has remained completely firm in rejecting even extraordinary offers for its sale, including Beck. The East Coast Drag Times article closed on the car by suggesting it would probably remain with its current owner until after his passing. There is a thread on the HAMB forum titled, "Where is Harry Luzader's 32 Coupe?" where someone wrote, "I understand that someone out there has Harry Luzader's 32 Ford Gasser. I would love to see that car restored." That was written years ago. The answer has not emerged publicly since. So somewhere out there, a lime green 1932 Ford 5-window coupe is sitting in someone's private possession in a configuration we do not know, in a condition we do not know, and Jeff Beck never got to own it, and the rest of us simply have to sit with that. Also worth addressing directly is a claim that has circulated in local press. A Trib Live report described Harry as being in the National Hot Rod Association Hall of Fame, and that is not accurate based on anything I could find. He was inducted into the East Coast Drag Times Hall of Fame in October 2016, which is a legitimate and genuinely meaningful honor given how seriously that organization documents the history of East Coast drag racing. But the NHRA Motorsports Museum's International Drag Racing Hall of Fame in Pomona is a completely separate institution, and Harry's name does not appear on that list in any source I found. The local newspaper reporter almost certainly saw the ECDT induction and conflated the two organizations. Do not repeat the NHRA Hall of Fame claim. The exhibit for the 75th anniversary 32 Ford show premiered at the January 2007 Grand National Roadster Show in Pomona, and the car was profiled in the official publication titled 32 Ford Deuce, the official 75th anniversary edition by Tony Thacker. That means Harry's lime green competition eliminator winner from Monroeville, Pennsylvania, is documented in the same volume as some of the most celebrated custom hot rods in the entire history of American automotive culture. The East Coast Drag Times article points this out with a certain quiet amusement. That honor came even though the car had always been powered by a small block Chevrolet. A Chevy-powered car on Ford's official list of the 75 most significant 1932 Ford. Ford picked Harry's car. That is genuinely funny and also absolutely correct, because the significance of a 32 Ford hot rod has nothing to do with what engine is inside it and everything to do with what the car means and what it achieved. Here is the bigger picture that I want to leave you with, because Harry Luzader's story sits inside a much larger story about what happened to the entire gasser class, and that arc is worth understanding properly. The gasser wars peaked somewhere around 1963 to 1966. The cars were getting faster, the rivalries were getting hotter, the match race circuit was generating real income, and fans were filling the grandstands to watch blown Willis coupes and Anglias do things that seemed physically impossible for street-bodied American cars. It was a genuine golden era. But the funny car was coming. The factory experimental programs from 1965 and 1966 had produced altered wheelbase super stock cars that Ford and Chrysler factory teams were campaigning hard, and those morphed quickly into flip-top fiberglass-bodied machines running on nitromethane that made the gassers look slow and quiet by comparison. Ohio George Montgomery abandoned his 33 Willis for a tube chassis Mustang in 1967. Stone Woods and Cook left for Top Fuel funny car the same year. Mazmanian followed in 1968. NHRA allowed tube frame chassis in the gas classes around 1968 and started permitting late-model body styles in gasser rules in 1967. And once you could run a late-model body on a tube frame, the visual distinctiveness of the classic gassers dissolved completely. They just looked like slow funny cars. The class was gone in all but name by 1970. NHRA formally eliminated the gas classes by 1972. Modified Eliminator absorbed the survivors and then got eliminated itself after 1981. Harry navigated all of that by adapting. He moved from gas to altered, then built the Opel to stay competitive as the rules shifted around him, and kept racing until 1990 when money finally ran out. That is 25-plus years in competitive drag racing, starting from zero with no outside money, no factory support, and no crew. That is an extraordinary run by any measure. And the reason people are still searching for that car online today, still posting on forums asking where it went, is not simply because it is a legendary 32 Ford that won at Indianapolis and carries a Jeff Beck story. It is because Harry Luzader's car represents something that the famous gasser cars never quite captured. It represents the middle. The vast, uncelebrated middle of the drag racing world where the cameras did not usually point, where magazine features did not usually run, where match race promoters were not signing contracts. The hundreds and eventually thousands of racers who built their cars in home garages, funded their programs with class winnings, and showed up at regional tracks week after week competing for wins that the national publications might mention in a results column if space permitted. The fact that one of those cars, produced by one of those racers, beat the entire field at Indianapolis on pure preparation, craftsmanship, and an insight about reaction time practice that nobody else in that paddock had thought of, is a story that every grassroots racer of every generation immediately recognizes. You have seen the version of Harry Luzader at your local track. You might be the version of Harry Luzader at your local track. The guy with the one-car operation and the hand-built engine who shows up consistently and occasionally beats people spending 10 times what he spends. The difference with Harry is that he did it at Indy in 1968. The car he did it with was a $400 junkyard 32 Ford. The engine was a 292-inch small block. He built himself in a garage behind a motel on a Pennsylvania highway. That is not a metaphor for anything. That is literally what happened. Harry Luzader drove that mint green deuce through eliminations at the U.S. Nationals, delivering launches timed with a precision he had quietly engineered for himself over an entire week of deliberate red lights, and he brought home the Wally. And somewhere out there that car still exists. Street Rod now. different configuration. Owner who is not selling. Jeff Beck wanted it and could not get it. Jeff Beck is gone now and the car is still wherever it is. And Harry Luzader is presumably still in Monroeville, Pennsylvania, at somewhere around 81 or 82 years old. One man. One car. $400. And a Wally from Indianapolis. That is the story of Harry Luzader and the classical gas 32 Ford. If this kind of deep dive racing history is what you come here for, subscribe, because there are a lot more stories exactly like this one buried in the record, and we are just getting started. It's June 1978. Raceway Park, Englishtown, New Jersey. A 50-year-old man climbs into a Ford Mustang II, nods once at his 25-year-old crew chief, and stages the car. The lights go green. The car launches. And at the other end of the track, the timing system prints out a number that stops the entire facility cold. 7.99 seconds at 175 miles per hour. The first 7-second elapsed time ever recorded by a door slammer in competition. Not a dragster. Not a funny car. A car with doors, a roof, and a body that could theoretically pass for something parked at a grocery store. And the man behind the wheel was 50 years old. That number didn't just break a record. It rewrote what anyone thought was possible, and the man who did it had been doing exactly that for over 2 decades. His name was Don Nicholson. Most people know him as Dyno Don. And here's what most people don't realize. That nickname wasn't a gimmick. It was a job description. And once you understand what that actually meant, the entire history of door slammer drag racing looks completely different. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the engineers and drivers who didn't just win races but fundamentally changed what racing looked like. If you're someone who wants to understand the real history behind the cars and the people who built the sport from the ground up, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Look, before we go any further, I want to clear something up right at the top, because there is a genuinely embarrassing amount of bad information floating around about this man. You will find sources, multiple sources, some of them with thousands of views and citations, that list his birth year as 1930 and his birthplace as Compton, California. Both are wrong. Donald Ray Nicholson was born on May 28, 1927. The family website says Springfield, Missouri, while the Motorsports Hall of Fame of America lists Halltown, Missouri, a small community about 30 miles away in Lawrence County. That discrepancy is probably just the difference between a precise rural birthplace and the nearest recognizable city. But the 1930 Compton version that gets copied everywhere online is simply incorrect, and I'm flagging it now because if you're doing any serious research on this man, those errors will throw you off immediately. What nobody disputes is that Nicholson grew up in Pasadena, California, and that Pasadena is where his racing life started. As a teenager in the late 1940s, he had a 1934 Chevy Coupe with a 235 cubic inch 6-cylinder fitted with a couple of 97 carburetors, and he drove it exactly the way you'd expect a teenager with a fast car to drive it. Speeding tickets, enough of them that, according to the family website, he joined the Navy while still in high school specifically because military service would wipe his record clean. Whether that's entirely accurate or carries some family legend in it, I can't confirm from primary sources. But it fits the pattern of a guy who always found an angle, always looked at a problem and found the exit that nobody else had spotted yet. After the Navy, he raced jalopies on oval tracks for a while, then quit around 1949. The reason was simple and brutal: too many of his friends were dying. He shifted over to dry lakes racing at El Mirage and Bonneville, which was the thing to do in Southern California at that point, and he was already competitive before the first organized drag strips even opened. Here's the thing about Nicholson's early career that most histories gloss over. He wasn't just a fast driver. He was building and tuning his own engines from the very beginning. The driving and the engineering were never separate activities for him. They were one thing, and that combination is exactly what made everything that came after possible. By the mid-1950s, he's doing body work and engine building professionally, and he lands a job managing the tune-up shop at Service Chevrolet in Pasadena. And this is where the whole story really starts, because Service Chevrolet had a chassis dynamometer. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so what, lots of shops have dynos. But in the late 1950s, that was genuinely unusual equipment. Not every shop had one. Not every mechanic who had access to one knew how to use it properly as a development tool rather than just a diagnostic machine. Nicholson was the first person at that dealership trained on it, and he took to it immediately. Because here's what a dynamometer does that nothing else does. It gives you numbers. Actual, measurable, repeatable numbers. You change something on the engine, you run it on the dyno, and you know exactly what that change did to power output. You're not guessing. You're not reading spark plug color and hoping your intuition is right. You have data. This is where it gets really interesting, because at a time when most racers were tuning carburetor jets by feel and making decisions based on experience and instinct, Nicholson had a systematic methodology. He would measure a combination, modify it, measure again, understand the relationship between the change and the result, and apply that understanding every time he built an engine afterward. The nickname Dyno Don came directly from this. He was the dynamometer guy. And that gap in methodology, data versus intuition, translated directly into a gap in performance that his competitors could feel but couldn't explain and definitely couldn't close. By 1961, Nicholson is working at Meade Chevrolet in Pasadena and has developed enough of a reputation locally that when the first NHRA Winter Nationals are organized at Pomona, he's positioned to participate seriously. And here's another error worth flagging. You'll sometimes see references to Nicholson campaigning Pontiacs in 1961 and 1962. He didn't. That appears to be a confusion with the broader GM factory racing involvement of that era, where Pontiac was heavily involved at the national level. Nicholson was a Chevrolet man, completely and entirely. He took delivery of a 409-powered Chevrolet Impala Sport Coupe literally the day before those first Winter Nationals. The 409 was in its first production year, and only about 142 of them had been built at that point. He was worried the suspension would be too stiff after sitting in a dealership lot, because new GM products often came with front coil springs and shocks that were too tight for proper weight transfer off the line on a drag strip. So he had somebody drive the car 500 miles overnight specifically to loosen up the front suspension before the race. Think about that for a second. Everyone else shows up and races. He shows up having already solved a problem that most people hadn't thought to think about yet. He won stock eliminator at those first ever Winter Nationals, then came back in 1962 with another 409 Bel Air and did it again. Back-to-back stock eliminator championships at the most prestigious drag racing event in the country, running quarter miles in the 12-second range and making it look completely routine. General Motors had a factory performance program running by then. They were providing special engines and parts to teams that won races and got their cars in the press, and Nicholson was exactly the kind of driver they wanted working with their equipment. He moved out to Atlanta to work with Nally Chevrolet because the Southeast was an incredibly lucrative match racing market, and having a Chevrolet dealership fund your operation while you toured the region racing other people's cars for guaranteed appearance fees was a genuinely good setup. The money was real, the exposure was real, and the competition was exactly the kind of environment where his methodology kept paying dividends. Then, in 1963, GM pulled the plug on everything. The corporate factory racing ban. No more official support, no more special parts, no more funded programs. Nicholson had a Z11 427 Impala by this point, and without factory backing behind it, the car became uncompetitive almost immediately because his competition still had factory support flowing through back channels and he didn't. Here's the thing about moments like this in a racing career. They either break you or they redirect you toward something bigger. For Nicholson, it redirected him toward Mercury, and that redirection changed drag racing permanently. Lincoln Mercury Division was building a drag racing program to counter what Ford Division was doing with the Thunderbolt. The guy running it was Fran Hernandez, a legendary figure in Southern California racing circles going back to the 1940s, and his deputy was Al Turner, who handled the day-to-day relationship management with drivers. They needed people who could win and who understood cars at a deep mechanical level, and Nicholson fit both requirements completely. They recruited him along with Ronnie Sox, Eddie Shartman, Jack Chrisman, and a few others to campaign A/FX Mercury Comet. A/FX stood for Factory Experimental, which was essentially a loophole category that let manufacturers build cars bearing resemblance to their production vehicles without having to meet standard class rules. The cars were prepared by Dearborn Steel Tubing, the same shop that built Ford's Thunderbolts, and Mercury produced somewhere around 21 of these Comets for 1964, all of them in Wimbledon white with red interiors. The 1964 Comet that Nicholson drove ran a 427 high-riser wedge engine with dual 4-barrel Holley carburetors running on 14:1 compression and making somewhere north of 500 horsepower. Fiberglass fenders and doors, teardrop fiberglass hood, Lexan windows, stripped interior. Now, here's where Nicholson immediately separated himself from everyone else in the program. His first car was actually a Caliente wagon rather than a coupe. And this was a deliberate engineering choice. The wagon had a shorter wheelbase and more weight over the rear axle, which he believed would improve weight transfer on launch. Nobody else picked wagons. Everybody else took the obvious choice. He thought about it differently, ran the numbers in his head, and picked the configuration that gave him an advantage that his competitors didn't even know they were missing. What happened over the course of 1964 is one of those stretches in motorsport history that's genuinely hard to comprehend even now. Sources vary on the exact numbers, and I want to be transparent about that disagreement. Dragzine reports 63 victories for the season. Street Muscle magazine claims 78 wins and 1 loss. The precise count is unrecoverable at this point because match racing wasn't centrally recorded the way national event results were. What every source agrees on is that his win rate was somewhere above 90% across the entire season. Let me put that in perspective for you. If a professional sports team won 90% of their games across a full season, we would talk about it for generations. Nicholson did it in a car, on tracks across the country, against the best competition the sport had to offer, while also being the guy who built and tuned the engine he was driving. The NHRA credits Nicholson with making the first 10-second pass in a door slammer that year. Some sources push this to 1965, but the NHRA's own profile of him says 1964, and I'm treating that as the more authoritative version. They also note he was among the first drivers to lift the front wheels on gear changes and to use narrow rims specifically to exaggerate the wrinkle wall effect on bias ply tires. Now, you might be thinking those sound like small details. They weren't. Every one of those techniques represented someone who understood the physics of what was happening at the contact patch and optimized for it deliberately. These weren't accidents. He understood what was happening mechanically and built his approach around that understanding while everyone else was still discovering the phenomenon by accident. For 1965, Mercury's cars got the 427 SOHC, the single overhead cam engine that Ford internally called the Cammer. This thing deserves its own dedicated video, honestly, because it was a complete departure from conventional American V8 design at the time. Most American big blocks used pushrods to operate their valves, a system that worked but imposed limits on how high the engine could rev and how efficiently it could breathe at high RPM. The Cammer ran a chain-driven overhead cam on each cylinder bank, which let it rev higher, breathe dramatically better, and produce power numbers that looked wrong on paper when people first saw them. In racing trim, The camera was putting out somewhere north of 700 horsepower, and it made everything that had come before it essentially obsolete overnight. The 1965 Comets were built by Bill Stropp in Long Beach, and initially not all of them had the SLHC because engine supply was limited. But by mid-season, Nicholson's car had the full setup and he was running it the way only he could run it, with data behind every tuning decision. The problem was that Chrysler had been busy while Ford was finishing the Camry. In early 1965, Chrysler took 12 of their B-body cars and moved the rear axle dramatically forward on each one, positioning it essentially under the driver's seat. 6 Dodges and 6 Plymouths, all with wheelbases chopped down to around 110 inches. Instead of weight being balanced across the car, you had more than half of it sitting directly on the rear tires. The cars looked genuinely bizarre. The front ends sat high, the proportions were completely wrong, and when they launched off the line, the weight transfer was so violent and so immediate that they were running deep into the 9-second quarter miles in something that was at least nominally still a door slammer. Somebody called them funny-looking. The name stuck, and an entire class of racing was born from that observation. NHRA banned them from competition, but the match race circuit didn't care about NHRA rules. On the match race circuit, they were monsters, and Ford's response initially was to forbid their factory teams from racing the altered wheelbase cars at all. The logic was straightforward: if you don't race, you can't lose. But that didn't work in practice because it meant Nicholson and the other Mercury guys were sitting out the most popular and most lucrative match races in the country, watching their appearance fee income disappear while Mopar teams collected it. Nicholson didn't wait for Ford to develop a policy. He found the angle himself, the way he always did. In August 1965, he had his steel-bodied A/FX Comet modified. He moved the rear axle forward 12 inches and switched from carburetors to a Hilborn mechanical fuel injection setup, then started running nitromethane. Same basic concept as the Mopar cars, but executed on his own initiative while Ford's corporate structure was still debating the situation in meeting rooms. Then he went out and beat the Ramchargers, one of Dodge's premier entries, running a 9.30 at 150 miles per hour. That result mattered far beyond just the one race. It proved the Ford camp could compete in this new configuration, it accelerated the development cycle for everybody, and it demonstrated once again that Nicholson's instinct for finding the solution before the problem was fully understood by everyone else was not a one-time thing. It was simply how he operated. For 1966, Al Turner at Mercury commissioned something genuinely new, something that would reshape what drag racing looked like for the next 6 decades. He contracted with Logie Brothers Stamping Company in Detroit to build tube chassis Comets with one-piece fiberglass bodies that hinged at the front and flipped forward to expose the entire drivetrain. You climbed in from the back. The engine was completely accessible in seconds, and the car weighed under 1,900 pounds. Whether Nicholson's Eliminator I was literally the first flip-top funny car ever built is legitimately disputed among historians, and I think it's important to be honest about that rather than making a definitive claim that can't be fully supported. The Motorsports Hall of Fame of America says, and I'm quoting directly here, if not the first to have one, Nicholson was certainly among the first 2 or 3. The Nicholson family website goes further and claims the flip-top format he established is what today's funny cars still use. Based on everything I could find across multiple sources, both statements are defensible. Somebody else may have built something similar at roughly the same time. But Nicholson's car was unquestionably among the very first, and his version was complete enough to go racing immediately and dominate from the moment it hit the track. The Eliminator I ran the 427 SLHC on Hilborn injection with 80% nitromethane and made somewhere around 1,000 horsepower in a car that weighed less than 1,900 pounds. Think about that power-to-weight ratio for a second. He was 3 to 4 tenths quicker than anything he had raced the previous season, which in drag racing terms is an eternity. The only driver who could consistently beat him that year was Eddie Shartman, who was also in a Logie-built Comet from the same Mercury program. Against everyone else, Nicholson was essentially untouchable. And then, in the second half of 1966 at Martin, Michigan, Nicholson recorded the first funny car 7-second elapsed time. Let that sink in. First 7-second funny car. First 10-second door slammer. Multiple times across his career, this man was the first person to break a barrier that nobody had broken before. That's not luck. That's not circumstance. That's a pattern, and it's a pattern that only emerges when someone is consistently operating at a level that nobody else has reached yet. For 1967, he got a new car with a Mercury Cougar body on a similar tube chassis and called it Eliminator 2. And I want to pause here to correct an error that appears in the Motorsports Hall of Fame entry for Nicholson, which describes the Eliminator I as having a Mercury Cougar body. Period photographs and essentially every other source confirm the Eliminator I had a Mercury Comet body. The Cougar body came with the Eliminator 2 in 1967. Small detail, but the kind of thing that matters if you're trying to get the history right rather than just repeating what somebody else wrote without checking it. Carcraft put him on their first all-star drag racing team in the match race category that year and named him Funny Car Driver of the Year. He won 86% of his races running naturally aspirated at this point, with the SLHC turning 7.90 seconds at around 180 miles per hour. In early 1968, he added a supercharger to the Cammer, and the results were immediately and violently impressive. He won the Irwindale New Year's Day race, qualifying at 8.03 and running a low of 7.99. He qualified number 1 at an NHRA meet at Lyons Dragway with a 7.63. He won the Stardust National Open with a 7.83 in the final. By the end of that season, the car was running in the 7.3s, which was absolutely staggering performance for the era. And then he quit Funny Car entirely. Now, you might be thinking that's insane. He was dominant. He was at the absolute peak of the class. He had equipment that was better than almost anything else out there. Why would you walk away from that? The reason he gave publicly was that the class had gotten too dangerous. Blower explosions were becoming a regular occurrence because teams kept adding boost faster than safety equipment could keep up with it. And when a supercharged nitro engine lets go at full power in the confined space under a funny car body, the results were horrific. Fires that couldn't be extinguished quickly. Structural failures that sent debris through the cockpit. He said the cars no longer resembled what Detroit was trying to sell, which was also true. But reading between the lines of what his contemporaries said about the decision, the primary driver was watching too many fires and crashes that could have killed someone or did. Here's what most people don't realize about this decision and why I think it reveals more about who Nicholson was than any race he ever won. Walking away from dominance requires a kind of clarity that most competitors simply don't have. When you're winning, the incentive structure pushes you to keep going. The money is flowing, the trophies are coming, the fans are cheering, and your ego tells you that you're the exception, that the danger applies to everyone else but not to you. Nicholson looked at the same situation and made an engineering calculation. The risk profile had changed. The probability of a catastrophic incident had increased to a level he wasn't willing to accept regardless of the rewards. That's not the decision of someone who races for ego or recognition. That's an engineer looking at variables and making a rational assessment. And it takes more courage to walk away when you're winning than it does to keep going when losing gives you nothing to protect. So the question became what next, and the answer started with phone calls. By 1968 and into 1969, Nicholson had organized an informal match racing group with Ronnie Sox, Bill Jenkins, who everyone called Grumpy, and Dick Landy, who had the nickname Dandy Dick. They raced carbureted, naturally aspirated, 4-speed cars in a heads-up format that was essentially the super stock rule set stripped down and made as honest and raw as possible. No nitro. No blowers. Just cubic inches and driver's skill and mechanical preparation. And here's the thing, this format was insanely popular with fans. People loved watching those four guys go at each other because the cars looked like something you could actually relate to, and the competition was brutally direct. You couldn't hide behind your fuel system or your supercharger. If you lost, it was because the other guy's car was better or he drove it better. Those are exactly the two things drag racing fans have always wanted to see settled. The NHRA was watching closely, and what they saw was demand. Enormous, consistent, paying demand for a type of racing that didn't have a formal class structure yet. In October 1969, they announced a new class called Pro Stock, which would debut at the 1970 Winter Nationals. The class rules allowed basically what those guys had been running. Door slammer bodies recognizable as production cars, naturally aspirated, carbureted, 4-speed manual transmissions. The connection between what Nicholson organized informally and what the NHRA created formally is not subtle. He didn't just compete in this class. He helped create the conditions that made the class necessary. And when the inaugural Pro Stock event was announced, Nicholson built a Ford Maverick with a 427 SLHC in 7 days. 7 days from raw materials to race ready. The car was put together by M&S Welding, and it was rough the way that first-iteration race cars always are, unrefined, imperfect, built on deadline. But it qualified and he ran it, establishing Ford's presence in Pro Stock from the very first event. Jenkins won that first race in a Chevrolet, but the point had been made. Ford was in the game because Nicholson put them there. The Pro Stock years are where things get properly impressive on a level that I think most casual drag racing fans don't fully appreciate, because this is where you see what Nicholson could do without a major factory operation behind him. By 1971, the Maverick was dialed in well enough that at the NHRA Summer Nationals, Nicholson won Pro Stock outright. Ford's first ever NHRA national event win in Pro Stock. That's not a small accomplishment given that Ford's factory program had basically been wound down by this point. He was doing this on his own resources, competing against guys like Jenkins who had factory backing and deep sponsor relationships and bigger budget. And he was beating them because the dynamometer approach, the data-driven methodology, the systematic engineering that had defined his career from the beginning, those advantages don't disappear just because you lose corporate support. They live in the person, not the organization. In 1972, he transitioned to a Ford Pinto, a smaller and lighter car that made better use of the Pro Stock weight rules. And in 1973, he opened the season in a way that nobody had opened a season before and nobody has matched since. He won the NHRA Winter Nationals, then the NHRA Winter Nationals, then the NHRA Gator Nationals. 3 consecutive national event wins across 2 different sanctioning bodies to open a single season. At the Winter Nationals that year, he set the first official NHRA Pro Stock elapsed time record at 9.33 seconds, then broke his own record the same day with a 9.01 at 150.50 miles per hour. His 60-foot times were consistently ahead of everyone else in the field, which meant he was getting off the line faster than anybody. And that advantage was a combination of 3 things: driver skill, chassis setup, and how the engine was making its power at lower RPM. All 3 of those things were under his direct control because he was doing all 3 of those jobs simultaneously. He was the driver. He was the chassis tuner. He was the engine builder. The integration of all 3 disciplines into one person meant there were no communication gaps, no misunderstandings between the guy driving and the guy tuning. The feedback loop was instantaneous because it existed inside one brain. The mid-1970s were a little more mixed in terms of result. Pro Stock got deeply competitive as more resources and more serious engineering talent flowed into the class, and the rules kept evolving in ways that sometimes favored one manufacturer's architecture over another. Nicholson went through a period of being competitive but not dominant, running Ford Mavericks and Pintos and early Mustangs, staying relevant but not winning championship. And I think this stretch is actually important to understand because it shows something that pure highlight reels never capture. Every great career has periods where the competition catches up, where the advantage narrows, where the innovation that separated you from everyone else becomes the baseline that everyone else builds from. What matters is what happens next. What happened next was John Cause. In 1977, Nicholson made a decision that was unusual for him. He committed to competing in the full NHRA national tour for the first time, rather than mixing NHRA events with IHRA events and heavy match racing the way he had for most of his career. He was going for the championship, and Cause, who was maybe 25 at the time, came on as crew chief and engine builder. The combination of Nicholson's decades of experience and racing instinct with Cause's technical precision and youthful energy was genuinely formidable. They ran a Ford Mustang II that was lighter than the earlier Mavericks and Pintos, and the small block Ford architecture they were working with was being pushed to limits that most engineers in the sport thought were physically impossible for a naturally aspirated racing engine. What happened over the course of the 1977 season was methodical in a way that's almost uncomfortable to watch if you were one of the people he was hunting down in the points standings. He won the Gator Nationals. He won the Spring Nationals. He won the U.S. Nationals, which is the single biggest and most prestigious race of the year. He made 5 final rounds total, and that consistency across the full national tour built a points lead that grew steadily all season long while other competitors had peaks and valleys in their result. But here's where the story takes a turn that reveals the full depth of how Nicholson's mind worked, because he didn't just outdrive and out-engineer the competition that year. He also outmaneuvered them. His main points rival in 1977 was Larry Lombardo, who drove for Bill Jenkins. Nicholson knew roughly what Lombardo needed to accomplish at an upcoming divisional event to stay mathematically alive in the championship picture. So Nicholson entered that divisional event himself, which was highly unusual because marquee drivers typically skip divisional races entirely. They're lower-profile events with smaller purses, and most top-tier competitors don't bother. But Nicholson entered, deliberately qualified low in the field so that the bracket would position him against Lombardo early in eliminations, then beat Lombardo in the first round and knocked him out of the points he needed to maintain his championship challenge. That's not just driving. That's chess. That's someone who understands the entire system he's competing in well enough to use the structure of the competition itself as a tactical weapon against a specific opponent. I've studied a lot of racing history across a lot of disciplines, and that kind of strategic sophistication is vanishingly rare. Most racers think about the next run. The great ones think about the next race. Nicholson was thinking about the entire season as a single integrated campaign. Bob Glidden finished second in the final standings that year, and Nicholson beat him by 1,400 points. At age 50, the NHRA said afterward, and this is significant enough that I want you to really hear it, that had Nicholson competed on the full national tour throughout his career rather than prioritizing match racing income, they believed he would have compiled a record similar to John Force in Funny Car or Warren Johnson and Bob Glidden in Pro Stock. That is an extraordinary statement from the sanctioning body itself. Force, Johnson, and Glidden are the names that define their respective classes for decades. They're the benchmarks. And the NHRA's own assessment was that Nicholson's career totals were limited not by ability or competitiveness but by economic reality, because match racing paid better and more reliably than the national tour did for most of the years he was competing. And then we arrive back at Englishtown. June 1978. The Mustang II by this point had a 516 cubic inch Ford wedge on an aluminum block with aluminum heads that almost nobody else in the class was running yet. John Caz confirmed in later interviews that the biggest engine they ever ran was a 589 cubic inch version based on a Ford Can-Am aluminum block. The setup was legitimately exotic for the era, cutting-edge metallurgy and engineering applied to a naturally aspirated door slammer application. 7.99 at 175 miles per hour. The first 7-second door slammer pass in recorded drag racing history. To be completely clear about what that means in the broader context of the sport, every car with a door on it that has ever run in the sevens since that day traces its lineage back to this run as the moment when someone first proved it was possible. Top fuel dragsters had been in the fives for years by that point. Funny cars had been in the SIXS. But a car that looked at least superficially like something that might sit in a dealership parking lot had never gone faster than 8 seconds until Nicholson and Caz did it. And the fact that the number on the time slip was 7.99, not 7.85 or 7.72 but exactly 7.99, is either the universe having a very specific sense of humor or it's a testament to exactly how precise Nicholson and Caz were at optimization. They didn't overshoot the barrier by a mile. They crossed it by the smallest possible margin, which tells you they knew almost exactly where their combination was going to land before they even staged the car. Now let me step back and actually assess what this man accomplished relative to his contemporaries, because I think this is where the story gets genuinely fascinating and where the real argument for his place in racing history crystallizes. Nicholson competed directly against Ronnie Sox across multiple eras. He competed against Bill Jenkins. He competed against Dick Landy. He competed against Bob Glidden. Each of those men was genuinely great at what they did. But here's the distinction that matters. They were each great at a narrower range of things than Nicholson was. Ronnie Sox was probably the best 4-speed shifter who ever lived. His reaction times were otherworldly. His ability to apply maximum power through a manual transmission without destroying the driveline was essentially supernatural. But Sox had Buddy Martin running the business side and Jake King building his engines. Sox was a driver, a phenomenal driver, but a specialist. Bill Jenkins was maybe the most innovative pure engine builder of the pro stock era. He understood cylinder head flow and combustion chamber geometry at a level that very few people matched before or after him. But Jenkins preferred to put other drivers in his cars, and when he did drive himself, it was typically because nobody else was available. He was an engineer, a phenomenal engineer, but also a specialist. Dick Landy drove and built, but never achieved the consistency across different eras, different rule packages, and different equipment platforms that Nicholson managed throughout his career. Bob Glidden won 10 pro stock championships and is legitimately one of the greatest racers the sport has ever produced, but Glidden came of age in the next generation after the factory wars and competed in a much more professionalized environment with deeper sponsor support. Nicholson did everything. He designed the combination. He built the engine. He tuned the chassis. He drove the car faster than almost anyone else could drive it, and he held final round appearances across 6 different NHRA eliminator categories: stock, super stock, competition eliminator, funny car, and pro stock. No other driver in NHRA history has done that. The breadth of what he could do, the range of classes and equipment types and eras across which he was competitive at the highest level, is genuinely without precedent in the sport's history. Buddy Martin, who ran the Sox and Martin operation and knew every top competitor in the sport personally, told people that Nicholson always had an edge because he never showed up just hoping he could win. He was always working an angle, always looking for something the other guy hadn't found yet. Ronnie Sox himself said that sometimes Nicholson would show up at a track looking disorganized, working on the car right up until the call to the staging lanes, and then go out and make the quickest run of the entire day. The appearance of chaos masked the reality that he knew exactly what he was doing and had probably been working since 3 in the morning to get there. Jim Thornton from the Ramchargers Dodge team, which was about as sharp and well-funded an operation as the Mopar side ever produced, said that when they were scheduled to race Nicholson, they knew they had to be absolutely ready because him and his mechanic Earl Wade were very tough to beat even when you thought you had the superior car. The match racing economy that sustained most of Nicholson's career deserves some serious attention because it's easy to look at his NHRA national event record and think you're seeing the whole picture when you're really only seeing a fraction of it. NHRA national events in the 1960s numbered fewer than a dozen per year, and the prize money wasn't particularly impressive. The richest driver purse for a stock world championship in 1967 was $10,000 for an entire season. Match racing was where the real money lived. Track promoters booked name drivers against each other on weekends and advertised Ford versus Chevy versus Mopar matchups that fans actually paid to see in huge numbers. Drivers got guaranteed appearance fees based on their drawing power, and drawing power was a function of two things: how often you won and how exciting it was to watch you do it. Drag Racing magazine readers voted Nicholson the #1 fan favorite and the #1 box office draw at drag strips 3 years running, 1965, 1966, and 1967. That correlation with his 90+% win rate is not a coincidence. Fans wanted to see the guy who was probably going to win but might just get beaten on any given night. When you've got a driver who can deliver both the likelihood of victory and the genuine uncertainty about whether tonight might be the exception, you've got someone whose appearance fee is completely justified by the seats he fills. Even during the championship 1977 season, Nicholson made most of his income from match racing rather than national event purses. The Mountain Motor Pro stock events at tracks like Maryland International Raceway were a major part of his revenue well into the early 1980s. He ran an Oldsmobile Cutlass Sierra in 1983 and 1984 and a Pontiac Firebird in 1986 and 1987, but those were independently acquired GM products, not factory relationship. His only genuine return to Chevrolet came in 1988, when he built a nostalgia recreation of his 1962 Bel Air and campaigned it through at least 2001. One thing I want to address directly because it creates confusion in some places. The car sometimes called the Bounty Hunter was not his. That was Connie Colita's funny car. I've seen the association made probably through confusion with the broader match racing scene of the late 1960s, but Nicholson's cars were the Eliminator I and Eliminator II, and his later pro stock entries didn't carry those names. John Caz, who came up under Nicholson during that 1977 championship season, went on to become one of the most celebrated Ford engine builders in racing history. 12 NHRA championships, multiple Engine Masters Challenge victories, a business called John Caz Racing Engines that remains highly regarded today. That's what a genuinely great mentor produces. Not just results during the partnership but a legacy that extends through the next generation and the generation after that. Nicholson died on January 24, 2006 at age 78. The cause was Alzheimer's disease. He was survived by his daughter Cindy Christie and his grandchildren Christopher and Candace Christie. His wife Patricia, whom he had married in 1950, had preceded him. The recognition he received was substantial but not always proportional to what he actually accomplished. The International Drag Racing Hall of Fame at the Don Garlits Museum inducted him in 1991 as part of the inaugural class. The Motorsports Hall of Fame of America followed in 1998. The NHRA named him 18th on their top 50 drivers list unveiled in 2001 for the organization's 50th anniversary. Competition Plus ranked him 15th in their all-time Mountain Motor Pro stock rankings. If you watch period footage of Nicholson at the starting line before a run, there's usually a ritual. He would sweep what the family website calls gold dust, basically powdered resin, onto the starting line surface for better traction. He would do 6 to 8 burnouts instead of the 1 or 2 that most drivers were doing. Then he would climb back into the car wearing the same expression he had when he got out of it. No performance for the crowd. No showmanship. Just preparation followed by execution. That quiet ritual is actually a pretty good summary of his entire career. There are still people who saw him race who talk about how he treated fans at events. His great-nephew wrote that there was no racer better with his fans than Don Nicholson. A 1976 Car Craft article described him getting out of the car after shutting the motor down, stopping to quietly talk to a 10-year-old kid for a few minutes, and that kid following him around for the rest of the entire day. He had that effect on people. The guy who was legitimately one of the best in the world at what he did was completely approachable and seemed to genuinely enjoy the interactions. That combination of real technical excellence and real human warmth is rare in any era of any sport. Most people who achieve that level of dominance develop edges, walls, distance. Nicholson apparently mostly didn't. The historical significance of what he did comes down to three things that I think deserve to be separated out clearly rather than collapse together the way most retrospectives handle them. First, the performance achievements themselves. Back-to-back Winter Nationals wins, first 10-second door slammer, first funny car 7-second pass, 3 consecutive national wins in 1973, the 1977 championship, the first 7-second door slammer in 1978. Each independently significant. Taken together, a career that touched almost every major performance threshold in street car drag racing history. Second, his role in shaping the classes themselves. The Eliminator I established the flip-top format that funny cars still use today. The match racing group he organized with Sox, Jenkins, and Landy created enough demand that the NHRA had to create pro stock. He didn't just compete in these classes. He helped define what they were. Third, what he modeled as an approach. Systematic data over intuition. Strategic sophistication over brute force. The willingness to walk away when the math changed, even when you were winning. The ability to adapt across 5 decades as everything around him transformed. Every door slammer that has run in the sevens since that day at Englishtown in June 1978 is racing in territory that Dyno Don Nicholson went to first. And every racer who uses a dynamometer to develop their combination, rather than guessing, is following a methodology he proved would work when nobody else believed the numbers mattered more than the feel. That's not just a legacy. That's a foundation. And the whole sport is still standing on it. It was 4:44 in the afternoon on a Friday in March 1992, and the crew chief was already walking away. Dale Armstrong had watched the run, seen the 4.82 elapsed time light up on the scoreboard, nodded to himself, and turned back toward the trailer. 2-step. Maybe 3. And then the crowd made a sound he couldn't explain. Not polite applause. Not the normal roar of a good qualifying pass. Something different. Something bigger. He turned around and looked at the other number on the board. 301.70 miles per hour. He almost missed it. The man who had spent 16 years engineering toward that exact moment almost walked away before he understood it had happened. At the other end of the track, Kenny Bernstein was sitting in the car when a corner worker reached in and pounded him on the chest and held up 3 fingers. Bernstein actually said out loud, "Do what?" because he thought he'd qualified third. That's how unexpected it was. Even for the team that built the machine and chased the number and dreamed about it every single week for years. The television crew from TNN had left Gainesville Raceway that afternoon to cover a Hall of Fame ceremony at the Don Garlits Museum about 40 miles away. The most significant moment in drag racing history happened in front of maybe a third of the cameras that were supposed to be there. The footage you've probably seen a dozen times is mostly a recreation they shot the following morning. No confetti. No perfectly timed slow motion. Just a Texas businessman in a fire suit going, "Do what?" while a Canadian farm kid who almost walked away stood at the other end of the track trying to process what just happened. And that right there tells you everything you need to know about what kind of story this actually is. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the moments in motorsport history that almost didn't happen the way we remember them. If you're someone who loves drag racing history, speed records, and the untold engineering stories behind the greatest milestones in the sport, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Here's the thing. Before March 20th, 1992, people genuinely did not know if 300 miles per hour was possible in NHRA top fuel. And I don't mean that as a casual observation. I mean that some of the most experienced minds in the sport, people who had spent their entire careers working with nitromethane engines and dragsters and timing slips, had looked at the data, looked at the physics, and concluded it might not happen. Ever. The speed progression in top fuel had been following this upward curve that kept flattening out the faster the cars went. Don Garlits hit 200 miles per hour back in 1964. Took about 11 years to reach 250. Then 260 came in 1984, and 270 in 1986, and 280 in 1987, and things seemed to be accelerating again. Connie Kalitta hit 290 in 1989, and if you did the math you thought, okay, 300 by 1991, maybe 1992 at the latest. Except that's not what happened. After 290, the progression basically stalled. Gary Ormsby pushed it to 294.88 in Dallas later in 1989, then 296.05 at Topeka in September of 1990, and then in 1991, the fastest speed of the entire year went backward. Don Prudhomme ran 293.15, which was the class best for the entire season, and then he told anyone who would listen that nobody was going to run 300 miles an hour. No one. Full stop. And here's what most people don't realize about why that stall made sense from a physics standpoint, even if it was frustrating to live through. Aerodynamic drag doesn't increase linearly with speed. It increases with the square of velocity. So going from 290 to 300 requires a disproportionate amount of additional power compared to the same gains that got you from 270 to 290. You were fighting exponentially harder for every additional mile per hour, and the tools available in 1991 to make that next step simply weren't enough. Which is exactly why when NHRA launched their Target 300 promotional campaign heading into 1992, and the oil company Slick 50 put up a $50,000 prize for the first driver to crack the barrier, there was legitimate skepticism about whether that prize would ever actually get paid out. National Dragster polled the top 10 top fuel finishers from the 1991 season on whether 300 was coming in 1992. Prudhomme said no. Darrell Gwynn said it would surprise him if it happened that year. Even Bernstein himself waffled on the question when asked directly. Only Corey McLenithan, who was 29 years old at the time, gave a flat yes, and everyone nodded politely and moved on. Now, you might be thinking, well, somebody always has to be first, and if the speeds were climbing, eventually someone was going to get there. And that's technically true. But the gap between 293 and 300 in the context of what these cars could actually do in 1991 was not a small gap. It was a wall. And understanding why it got crossed when it did, and by who and how, requires going back much further than March of 1992. Kenny Bernstein grew up in Lubbock, Texas, the son of a department store manager who had been a B-29 pilot. He was selling socks at his father's counter by age 9, working the pitch on whoever wandered close enough to hear him. He played linebacker in high school at 5'7" and 180 pounds, which tells you something about his approach to obstacles because that is not a build that suggests someone who waits around to see what happens next. He attended Arlington State College on a business track, but left before graduating because racing needed doing and money needed figuring out. For several years in the late 60s and early 70s, he bounced between driving for other car owners and working as a traveling salesman for a teenage girls' clothing line called Whistle Stop, which is genuinely one of the more unexpected details in this entire story. He started a wrecker service in Dallas that eventually grew to about a dozen trucks, all of it to fund racing. He reached the funny car final at the 1973 Winter Nationals, but couldn't afford to compete at the level required to stay competitive. So he did something most racers wouldn't do. He quit. He opened the Chelsea Street pub in Lubbock in November of 1973, and by 1978, he had somewhere between 17 and 20 locations across 5 states employing roughly 2,500 people. He built a restaurant chain from scratch in 5 years. And then the phone rang. Gene Beaver, who owned the LA Hooker Funny Car, pulled him back in. He raced again in 1978, didn't qualify at his first event back, but was completely hooked. By 1979, he was running his own team with legendary engine builder Ed Pink, and he won his first NHRA national event that year, the Cajun Nationals in Baton Rouge. Quick story about that win. Reigning pro stock champion Bob Glidden noticed that the winner's photo was going to be shot with Bernstein partly hidden by the magazine mailing label. So Glidden switched places with him in the photo, unprompted, without being asked. Bernstein never forgot that. And it says something about the culture of that paddock that someone did something like that without expecting anything in return. The Budweiser deal that came together in 1980 is the stuff of sponsorship legend, and it's worth understanding properly because it shows exactly how Bernstein operated when he was at his best. He pitched Anheuser-Busch's regional teams and corporate contacts, and then drove his race car to their headquarters in St. Louis and fired up the engines as a new work shift arrived. The employees poured out to watch. The executives looked down from office windows. He got the meeting. The first check was $25,000 from corporate, and he leveraged that with local wholesalers and regional matching funds until he had roughly $80,000, which was enough to run a season. That sponsorship lasted 30 years. 30 years. It outlasted STP's deal with Richard Petty and became the longest-running sponsorship in motorsports history. But here's the thing about the early years of the Budweiser car. It was rough. Bernstein frequently failed to qualify, and rivals in the pits started making jokes about how soon the Bud would be on somebody else's car. He was delivering massive media coverage for the sponsor because he understood that game better than almost anyone, but on the racetrack the results weren't there yet. That changed completely in 1982 when he hired Dale Armstrong. And this is where it gets really interesting. To understand what Dale Armstrong brought to Kenny Bernstein's operation, you have to understand what drag racing engineering looked like before him, and then what it looked like after. And the gap between those two things is significant enough that it's not really an exaggeration to say there was a before Armstrong era and an after Armstrong era in nitro racing, and the sport is measurably faster because of which side of that line we're currently on. Armstrong was born in Holden, Alberta in 1941 and learned to drive on farm roads outside Calgary. He bought his first car, a 1936 Ford Coupe, for $5 at age 14. $5. He started drag racing in 1957 at an airstrip near Calgary and eventually moved to Southern California in 1965 because he could race 5 nights a week there, and that's basically impossible to argue with if drag racing is your actual priority in life. His car, the Canuck, made the cover of Hot Rod magazine in December of 1966. He was good enough as a driver to win the 1975 NHRA Pro Comp World Championship, and a 240-mile-per-hour crash in his Dodge Challenger at Columbus, Ohio was what ultimately convinced him to transition to crew chief work full-time. His words on that crash were pretty much just, "Yeah, that was kind of a bad one. It told me it was time to get out of the driving seat." No drama. No lengthy reflection. Just a Canadian farm kid processing information and updating his plan accordingly. What made Armstrong genuinely different from other crew chiefs of his era started with the data recorder, and this is the single most important thing he ever did, even though it's not necessarily the first thing people think of when his name comes up. He worked with a couple of engineers, including Ron Armstrong, no relation, to adapt onboard data logging technology to function inside the electromagnetic catastrophe that a running nitromethane engine creates. The ignition interference alone was enough to destroy most electronics of that period. They figured out how to shield the sensors and get reliable readings out of a vehicle that was essentially a rolling electrical storm, making a quarter-mile pass in under 5 seconds. And what those readings showed was shocking to people who thought they already understood these cars. Armstrong said it himself plainly. Everyone thought the engines were revving 9,000 RPM. They were only going 7,000. Nobody knew because nobody had actually measured it properly before. The clutch timing that people had been dialing in by feel and intuition and hard-won experience for years turned out to be nowhere near optimal when you could finally see what was actually happening in real time during a run. He later called the onboard computer the single most important advancement in drag racing in modern times and said there wasn't anything else that even came close. Look, in a sport where fractions of a second separate winners from losers and where a wrong assumption about what's happening inside your engine can cost you a race or destroy a motor worth tens of thousands of dollars, having actual data instead of educated guesses is not a small advantage. It's a fundamental shift in how the game is played. So that's what he brought to Bernstein's operation in 1982. An empirical approach to a sport that had been running almost entirely on instinct, experience, and the accumulated tribal knowledge of people who had been doing it long enough to have strong opinions about everything. The combination of Bernstein and Armstrong turned out to be formidable in a way that neither of them might have achieved separately. Bernstein could raise the money, drive the car, manage relationships with sponsors, and had the organizational discipline to run a professional racing team at that level. Armstrong had the engineering mind, the willingness to try things nobody else had tried, and crucially, the willingness to throw out assumptions that couldn't survive contact with actual data. From 1985 through 1988, they won 4 consecutive NHRA Funny Car Championship, 4 straight, in a class that was as competitive as any in motorsport at that level. Here's what most people don't realize about those championship years. Armstrong was the first crew chief to put a funny car body through wind tunnel testing, which sounds completely obvious in retrospect but was genuinely unusual for straight-line drag racing at the time. The 1987 Buick LeSabre Batmobile body was designed using actual aerodynamic analysis rather than just aesthetic preference and racing instinct. He also developed the multi-stage lock-up clutch system working with Tony and Lanny Miglizzi at LNT Clutches, and that system became the universal standard across nitro racing after everyone else figured out it was faster. The old clutches in nitro cars had never fully locked up during a run, and the assumption across the entire sport was that this was just how it worked, just a fundamental characteristic of the machinery. Armstrong had the data to prove it wasn't a fundamental characteristic. It was a fixable problem, and he fixed it, and then everyone else eventually caught up to where he already was. In 1990, Bernstein made the switch from funny car to top fuel, and the chase toward 300 miles per hour became something real and immediate rather than abstract and theoretical. Now, here's the landscape of the early 1990s top fuel field, because context matters enormously here. Gary Ormsby was the 1989 champion tuned by Lee Beard and had pushed the speed record to 296.05 miles per hour at Topeka in September 1990. Joe Amato had won championships in 1984, 1988, 1990, and 1991 and was widely regarded as running the most technically sophisticated operation in top fuel at that time. Eddie Hill was running his yellow Pennzoil dragsters and had already broken the 4-second elapsed time barrier back in 1988, which earned him the nickname the Forefather. Don Prudhomme, who like Bernstein had switched from funny car, had the fastest speed of 1991 at 293.15 miles per hour and was publicly and confidently telling people 300 was not coming. Gary Ormsby should get more space in this story than he usually does because his situation was genuinely heartbreaking and it shaped the emotional context of the 300 miles per hour chase in ways that people don't always acknowledge when they tell this story. He won the 1989 championship and was diagnosed with cancer not long after. He raced the entire 1990 season while fighting the disease and nearly won a second consecutive title, losing to Joe Amato in the final round of the final race of the year. His condition worsened through 1991 and he was forced out of the car mid-season. He died on August 28, 1991, the day before the U.S. Nationals in Indianapolis. He was 49 years old. The man who had pushed the speed record to 296 and who by almost any measure seemed most likely to be the one who broke 300 didn't live to see it happen. Bernstein said at the time that it was a great loss for a friendship and a great loss for the sport, and that is about as understated as you can possibly be about something like that. So heading into 1992, Armstrong made a personnel move that is absolutely central to the whole story, and it's one that not everyone knows about. He hired Wes Cerny away from Roland Leong's Hawaiian Punch Funny Car team at the end of 1991. Now here's why that mattered specifically. Cerny had tuned that funny car to the first 290 miles per hour pass in funny car history. And Armstrong's logic was direct and clean. If a funny car, which is a heavier and aerodynamically compromised vehicle compared to a top fuel dragster, could run 290 miles per hour, then a top fuel dragster running the same combination should theoretically be capable of over 300. Cerny brought Dart cylinder heads that had been specifically ported by Steve Sanchez at Total Flow Products, and that head combination turned out to be a meaningful piece of the puzzle that was sitting on the table waiting to be assembled correctly. The first two events of the 1992 season, the car ran no faster than 289 miles per hour. Solid numbers, competitive numbers, but not what they were hunting. Then came the Slick 50 Nationals in Houston 2 weeks before the Gator Nationals, and suddenly things got very interesting very fast. Bernstein ran 296.93 in spite of dropping cylinders during the run. Mike Dunn posted 297.12 miles per hour, which was the fastest pass in history at that point. Pat Austin set the official national speed record at 295.27. Multiple cars were running in the mid to high 290s in the same qualifying session, and the question shifted almost overnight from whether 300 would ever happen to who was going to get there first. The $50,000 prize suddenly felt very real and very close, and every team in that field knew it. But between Houston and Gainesville, Armstrong and Cerny figured out something that nobody else had cracked. And this is the part of the story that deserves the most careful attention because this is the actual engineering key to what happened on that Friday afternoon. This is where it gets really interesting. The problem with the magnetos in nitromethane engines at that time was that the permanent magnets inside them would degrade after each race. The magnets would lose strength from the heat and the vibration and the electromagnetic chaos of a running fuel engine. They'd need to be recharged after every event, and even then they'd lose a little more strength each time. What that meant in practice was that the ignition energy available at the spark plugs was inconsistent and progressively weaker than it needed to be, especially in the upper half of a run when maximum ignition energy mattered most and the engine was working hardest. Armstrong and Cerny went to work on this specific problem in the window between Houston and Gainesville. They replaced the standard permanent magnets with rare earth magnets, which are significantly stronger and considerably more stable under the extreme conditions inside a running fuel car. Then they added external condensers to the magneto assemblies, which effectively doubled the available amperage from roughly 22 amps per plug up to around 44. The condensers were visible on the outside of the magneto housing, so the modification didn't stay secret for very long after the run, but in the specific window between Houston and Gainesville, they were the only team running this setup. Nobody else had it. Armstrong later said he literally carried those modified magnetos in his carry-on bag on the flight from Houston to Florida. He was not checking that luggage under any circumstances. Think about that for a second. The technical solution to the 300 miles per hour barrier was riding in the overhead bin of a commercial flight between Texas and Florida, wrapped in whatever Armstrong used to protect it, because he was not letting it out of his sight. The 1992 Gator Nationals at Gainesville Raceway started without any particular sign that history was about to be made. There was no electricity in the air that Thursday that felt different from any other early season race. Pat Austin reset the track record to 292.39 during Thursday qualifying. Bernstein ran 291.26, which was good enough to put him in the field, but nothing that made anyone turn around and stare at the scoreboard. The first qualifying session on Friday produced nothing remarkable either. Cars were running well. The weather was cooperating. But there was no indication from anyone in the pits or the grandstands or the broadcast booth that this particular afternoon was going to matter more than any other Friday afternoon in the history of the sport. The second qualifying session on Friday started in the afternoon, and Armstrong had his crew select the first pair to run. They had installed the condensed magnetos that morning, and the entire setup was dialed in and ready. Here's a detail that matters more than it seems at first glance. Armstrong actually reduced power from the configuration they'd been running after the car shook the tires on Thursday. He took power out of the car before the historic run because the previous attempt had been too aggressive and lost traction. Now you might be thinking, wait, you're telling me they were chasing the highest speed in the history of the sport and they deliberately made the car less powerful right before the attempt? Yes. That's exactly what happened. And it tells you everything about Armstrong's philosophy. More power doesn't help if the tires can't use it. The fastest car is the one that puts the power down cleanly, not the one with the most power on the dyno. He understood that relationship better than anyone else in the paddock. At 4:44 p.m. Eastern Time on March 20, 1992, Kenny Bernstein rolled to the starting line in the left lane. Al Segrini and Billy Lynch's dragster was his qualifying partner in the right lane. The Christmas tree came down. And right there at the launch, Segrini immediately smoked the tires. Now this is one of those random details that seems trivial but actually mattered because it meant the track was effectively Bernstein's alone for the entire run. No tire smoke drifting across to his side of the track. No contamination of the racing surface in his lane. No visual distraction from a car losing traction next to him. He had the whole quarter mile to himself, clean air and clean asphalt from start to finish. The Budweiser King left the starting line hard with the front end coming up 9 or 10 inches and tracking perfectly straight. The acceleration through the first half of the track was fast but not historically remarkable by the standards of what the top cars were running at that point in the season. What happened in the back half of the run was different. From mid-track to the finish line, the car was doing something nobody had ever seen before. The acceleration wasn't just continuing, it was building in a way that defied what people expected from a top fuel car in that era. The rare earth magnets and the doubled amperage from the external condensers were delivering consistent full-power ignition events through the entire run instead of fading in the back half the way conventional magnetos did. Every cylinder was firing at maximum efficiency all the way through instead of progressively weakening as the magnets lost their edge under the punishment of a full pass. And then approximately 200 feet before the finish line, a cylinder went quiet. Bernstein felt it immediately. Any experienced top fuel driver would recognize that sensation because when you're sitting inches behind 8 cylinders producing somewhere north of 5,000 horsepower collectively, and one of them stops contributing, the car changes character instantly. The sound changes. The vibration patterns shift. And every instinct built up over years of driving tells you to lift, because dropping a cylinder 200 feet from the stripe means you've lost combustion events you need, and you're dumping raw nitromethane into an exhaust pipe at terminal velocity, and the run is probably compromised anyway. But Bernstein didn't lift. He said afterward that he told himself to drive it all the way out the back door because it might be the run and he didn't care if it dropped every cylinder it had. That decision, that fraction of a second where a driver with decades of experience overrode every instinct he had and stayed in the throttle, is the human element that no amount of engineering can replace. Armstrong could build the car. Cerny could tune the magnetos. But somebody had to drive it through the moment when everything felt wrong and not back out. And that somebody was a 5'7" former sock salesman from Lubbock, Texas, who had never once in his life backed away from something because the odds didn't look favorable. The scoreboard lit up. 4.823 seconds. 301.70 miles per hour. Both numbers were records. The 4.823 was the quickest elapsed time in top fuel history at that moment. The 301.70 was the first time any NHRA-sanctioned drag racing vehicle had exceeded 300 miles per hour. And it happened with a cylinder that quit firing 200 feet before the finish line on a car that was running less power than planned. Let that sink in for just a moment. The car broke 300 miles per hour on 7 cylinders with a detuned setup. Armstrong was honest about the dropped cylinder afterward. He said he didn't want to tell anyone at first because he knew people would say, "Yeah, right, sure, 7 cylinders, tell me another one." But the data recorder that he had pioneered years earlier, the same technology that had changed the entire sport's approach to engineering, confirmed exactly what happened. The car ran 301 on 7 cylinders for the last 200 feet, and that's just the documented factual reality of what occurred. Armstrong found out the number when the crowd started roaring while he was walking back toward the van. Bernstein found out when the corner worker reached into the cockpit and pounded him on the chest. Both of them needed a second to process what had just happened because neither of them was emotionally prepared for it to happen right then, exactly like that. It's one of the strangest things about this story, that the two people most responsible for breaking the barrier were among the last people at the track to actually understand what they'd done. The crowd knew before either of them did. Now the rest of that weekend is a story that gets completely overshadowed by what happened on Friday afternoon, and that's completely understandable because Friday afternoon was the biggest moment in the history of the sport. But the rest of the weekend matters, and it's worth covering properly because there are details here that most people have never heard. Sunday eliminations saw Bernstein run 298.30 in round 1 and then 299.30 in the quarterfinals against Tommy Johnson Jr. Here's what most people don't realize about that 299.30 quarterfinal pass. That run served as the required backup within 1% of the original speed to establish 301.70 as the official NHRA national speed record. Without the backup run, the qualifying pass stands in the record books as a performance, but it doesn't become the sanctioned official national record. The 1% rule existed specifically to ensure that record performances weren't flukes or measurement errors, and Bernstein needed to back up his Friday run with something within roughly 3 miles per hour of 301.70. He ran 299.30 on Sunday and that sealed it. So that quarterfinal pass against Tommy Johnson Jr. mattered far more historically than it appeared in the moment because it was the run that turned a spectacular qualifying number into the official barrier-breaking record. Eddie Hill, meanwhile, was having his own extraordinary weekend. He set a new elapsed time record at 4.801 seconds in the quarterfinals. Fast Eddie, at 56 years old, was still pushing the boundaries of what was possible in top fuel and running quicker than anyone had ever gone. The final round that Sunday was Bernstein versus Hill, and Bernstein smoked the tires at the starting line. Hill ran clean and won, becoming at that moment the oldest driver to win an NHRA professional class national event. Kenny Bernstein did not win the 1992 Gator Nationals. He lost in the final. He was gracious about it afterwards, saying he was disappointed to lose the race but proud of the milestone from that Friday. National Dragster probably captured the long view best when they wrote that long after most people have forgotten who won the 1992 Motorcraft Gator Nationals, they will remember what took place on that Friday afternoon. And 33 years later, that assessment has proven completely correct. Now here's what happened after 300 fell. And this part of the story rarely gets the attention it deserves because people assume that once the barrier was broken, everyone immediately started running 300 plus. That's not what happened at all. It took nearly 11 months for anyone else to reach 300 miles per hour. Doug Herbert ran 301.23 at the 1993 Winter Nationals, and Don Prudhomme, the same man who had publicly and confidently stated that nobody was going to run 300 miles per hour, matched that speed in Houston not long after. Carcraft magazine named Bernstein, Armstrong, and Cerny jointly as Person of the Year for 1992, which was a reasonable editorial decision given the significance of what they accomplished. The slick 5,300-mile-per-hour club that had been established as a promotional concept tied to the prize money eventually filled out to 16 members. But it took 3 full years to reach that number, which tells you exactly how far ahead of the rest of the field Bernstein and Armstrong were in that specific moment in March of 1992. They weren't incrementally ahead. They were categorically ahead. And Bernstein kept pushing. In 1994, he became the first driver to break 310 miles per hour, running 311.85 on his way to eventually posting 314.46 at Pomona. The man who broke 300 also broke 310. In 1996, he won the NHRA Top Fuel Championship, making him the first driver in the history of the sport to win world championships in both funny car and top fuel. 2 different categories, 2 different vehicle types, 2 different driving disciplines, one driver who conquered both. That 1996 championship year is complicated though, and it deserves to be told honestly because Bernstein himself was never comfortable treating it as a pure celebration. Driver Blaine Johnson died during the season in a crash that shook the entire Top Fuel community to its core. At the year-end awards banquet, Bernstein did something that most champions would never consider. He gave his championship trophy to Blaine's brother Alan Johnson, who went on to become one of the most respected crew chiefs in the history of the sport. It's one of the more genuinely generous and emotionally intelligent acts in the history of the paddock, and Bernstein himself called that title somewhat tainted because of what happened to Blaine. He won the championship on point. He earned it on the racetrack. But he couldn't separate the accomplishment from the loss, and he didn't try to. That tells you something about the man that no speed record or elapsed time ever could. He won again in 2001, and this time the numbers were staggering. He set world records of 332.18 miles per hour and 4.477 seconds, and won 8 national events and 61 rounds of competition in a single season, which was an NHRA record at that time. Think about what those numbers represent in the context of where the sport had been less than a decade earlier. In 1991, the fastest speed of the entire year was 293 miles per hour, and people were openly questioning whether 300 was physically achievable. By 2001, Bernstein was running 332 and winning 8 events in one season. The rate of progress that he and Armstrong and the people who followed their methodological approach unlocked was genuinely extraordinary. He retired from full-time driving in 2002. That retirement lasted about 5 minutes. In 2003, his son Brandon broke his back in a crash at Englishtown, and Bernstein came out of retirement to get back in the car. At that point he was in his early 60s, and the idea of a driver that age competing at the highest level of Top Fuel would have been dismissed by most people as sentimentality or stubbornness or both. He won 4 of the last 5 events of the 2003 season. 4 of 5. He finished with 39 top fuel wins, which put him ahead of Don Garlits on the all-time victory list. The man who had sold socks at a department store counter, and built a restaurant chain, and talked his way into a 30-year Budweiser sponsorship by firing up a race car engine in a parking lot in St. Louis, retired from competitive driving, having won more top fuel races than the father of the sport himself. Brandon Bernstein took over the Budweiser King car in 2003 after recovering from his injury, and won 5 of his first 13 starts, which is about as hot a debut as the top fuel class had ever seen. He compiled 19 top fuel career victories before the team eventually shut down operations and then moved into the business side of the sport, working in partnership marketing and sponsorship development. The Bernstein name didn't leave drag racing. It just changed roles. Kenny Bernstein announced his full retirement from NHRA competition in November of 2011. By that point, the sport he had helped reshape looked almost nothing like the one he had entered decades earlier, and his fingerprints were on a significant portion of the changes that had occurred in between. Dale Armstrong died on November 28, 2014 in Temecula, California from complications of sarcoidosis. He was 73 years old. The tributes that poured in after his death were almost unanimous in identifying what made him genuinely special, and it was not any single innovation or any particular championship or even the 300 miles per hour run specifically. It was the underlying methodology. Measure everything first. Then change one thing at a time. Look at what the data actually tells you. And do not assume the answer before you have the numbers. That approach sounds obvious now in an era where every professional racing team in every discipline has data engineers and telemetry systems and simulation software. But in the context of 1980s nitro drag racing, it was genuinely revolutionary. The sport is measurably and demonstrably faster because Dale Armstrong existed and applied his particular way of thinking to the problem of making nitromethane engines go faster than anyone else thought they could. His quote about the 300 miles per hour run is the one that stays with me every time I come back to this story. He said being the crew chief on the first car to run 300 means more to him than any national event win or any Winston championship, and there isn't any question about it. People will forget what years we won the championship, but they'll never forget when 300 was run and who did it. He was right about that. He got inducted into the Canadian Motorsports Hall of Fame in 1995, the International Drag Racing Hall of Fame in 2008, and the Motorsports Hall of Fame of America in 2010. NHRA ranked him 10th on their top 50 drivers list, a ranking that covers his driving career independently of his crew chief accomplishments because his resume behind the wheel justified inclusion all by itself. Now here's where the long shadow of the 300 miles per hour barrier extends into the modern era of the sport, and this is something that doesn't get discussed enough. The barrier breaking itself did not immediately trigger rule changes from NHRA. The speeds kept climbing steadily through the 1990s and into the 2000s, and the sanctioning body's response came in reaction to accumulating safety concerns rather than any single speed on the scoreboard. The 90% cap on nitromethane concentration was implemented in 2000 after a string of catastrophic engine failures throughout the 1999 season. That percentage was briefly reduced to 85% following Darrell Russell's fatal crash in 2004 and then restored to 90% in 2008 when other safety improvements had been implemented. But the most significant structural change in the modern history of drag racing came on July 2, 2008 when NHRA shortened top fuel and funny car races from 1,320 feet, the traditional quarter mile that had defined the sport since its inception, down to 1,000 feet. This decision came directly in response to Scott Kalida's fatal crash at Englishtown on June 21, 2008. His funny car engine exploded at approximately 300 miles per hour, and the resulting damage to both parachutes meant the car ran through the entire shutdown area and through the sand trap and catch net and out the other side of the safety systems that were supposed to stop it. Bernstein, who was serving as president of the Professional Racers Organization at the time, said publicly that he understood this constituted a fundamental change to the historic format of running a quarter mile. But it was the most immediate adjustment available in the interest of driver safety, and he supported it without reservation. The 1,000-foot format is permanent. It is not going back. And in a very real sense, the first 300 miles per hour pass in 1992 was the beginning of a chain of events that eventually changed the fundamental distance of the race itself. Not directly, not immediately, but the speed increases that Bernstein and Armstrong unlocked through their methodological approach kept compounding year after year as other teams adopted similar engineering philosophies. The cars kept getting faster. The track stayed the same length. And eventually the speed outgrew the distance and something had to change. The track got shorter because the cars got too fast for the space they were running in and the safety systems that were supposed to protect drivers at the far end. Here's where things stand today, and this is where the full scope of what happened in March 1992 comes into focus. The left lane at Gainesville Raceway bears Kenny Bernstein's name. NHRA fans voted the 300 miles per hour run the #1 moment on the organization's top 75 moments list as part of the 75th anniversary celebration in 2026. The current NHRA top fuel national speed record is 343.51 miles per hour set by Brittany Force at the 2025 U.S. Nationals, a speed achieved over 1,000 feet rather than 1,320. The first funny car to break 300 was Jim Epler in October 1993, 18 months after Bernstein's run. The 310 mark fell to Bernstein himself in 1994. The 320 mark to Corey McLenathan in 1997. Corey McLenathan, the only driver in that 1991 poll who said yes, 300 is coming. The 330 mark to Tony Schumacher in 1999. Speeds that seemed genuinely impossible in 1991 became routine qualifying numbers by the early 2000s. And there's one more detail from that Friday afternoon in 1992 that I keep coming back to every time I think about this story. Armstrong reduced power before the run. The car dropped a cylinder 200 feet from the finish, and it still set both the speed record and the elapsed time record simultaneously. The first 300 miles per hour pass happened on 7 cylinders with a detuned setup while the television cameras were 40 miles away filming a museum ceremony and the crew chief was walking back to the trailer and the driver thought he might have qualified third. Bernstein said at one point that the 300 miles per hour pass is the one thing everyone seems to remember across the board. And that it was probably the last true barrier this sport would ever see because the next one, if there even is one, might not happen in anyone's lifetime. He might be right about that. 340 miles per hour in 1,000 feet is a number that didn't seem real 10 years ago. And yet here we are watching Brittany Force run 343. But 300 in 1,320 feet happened first. March 20, 1992. 4:44 in the afternoon. Gainesville, Florida. While the TV crew was somewhere else and the crew chief was walking away and the driver thought he qualified third. A Texas kid who used to sell socks at a department store counter and a Canadian farm boy who bought a car for $5 at age 14 and spent the next 4 decades figuring out how to make nitromethane engines go faster than anyone thought was possible. That's who ran 300 first. And that's how they got there. In 1985, a man sat down for an interview and said something that sounds like it belongs in a movie, except the engineers had the printout right there in front of them, and the numbers didn't lie. Ronnie Sox told the interviewer that when Chrysler strapped a computer to his car to measure exactly what he was doing behind the wheel, they discovered he could shift gears faster than an automatic transmission. Not almost as fast. Not within a reasonable margin. Faster. A human being with a clutch pedal and a gear lever was outperforming a mechanical system that was specifically engineered, with no wasted motion, no hesitation, no nerves, to change gears at the optimal moment every single time. The engineers looked at the data. They checked it again. And then they had to accept what they were seeing because the numbers were right there on the printout, and numbers don't have an ego to protect. Now here's the thing. If you already know that story, you probably know the version most people tell. The pro stock era. The Plymouth muscle cars. The rivalry with Bill Jenkins. The 5 NHRA championship. The years when Ronnie Sox was basically the dominant force in a class that drag racing had essentially invented around his specific skill set. That's the chapter that gets repeated. That's where most of the coverage lives. And it deserves every word written about it. But that's not actually where this story starts, and it's not where the ability came from. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the drivers, the machines, and the forgotten chapters that made drag racing what it is. If you're someone who loves the deep history of motorsport and wants to understand not just what happened but why and how it happened, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Here's what most people don't realize about Ronnie Sox. Before he was the Plymouth factory legend, before Pomona, before Pro Stock, before any of it, there were 12 years of grinding regional competition on Carolina airport strips and small-town drag tracks that almost nobody ever talks about. There were thousands of gear changes on dark roads before he entered a single sanctioned event. There were 48 races won in a row at a local track before anyone outside of Burlington, North Carolina had ever heard his name. There were 4 different factory conversations before Chrysler finally got to him. And there is a full arc, from a kid quietly borrowing his father's Oldsmobile at night to the man who would eventually make drag racing engineers genuinely question whether human beings had physical limits at all. That's what we're going to dig into today. But I want to address something honestly before we go further, because the framing here requires it. The title of this video mentions gasser days, and that requires some real transparency up front. Ronnie Sox was not a gasser racer. There is no credible evidence he ever campaigned a gas coupe and sedan class car. No Willis coupes with straight front axles. No Henry JS. No Anglias with the nose pointed at the sky. The gasser world had its own legends, its own heroes, its own culture, and Sox simply wasn't part of that lineage. What Sox was, from the very beginning, was a stock and super stock racer. He drove late-model production cars, or very close approximations of them, in every competitive class he ever entered. The reason I'm framing this as his early years rather than abandoning the premise entirely is because the impulse behind that framing is pointing at something genuinely real. Before Sox became the Plymouth factory legend, there was an entire competitive life that almost nobody discusses. And the skills he built during that time are exactly, specifically, and provably what made everything else possible. The story of how Ronnie Sox became Ronnie Sox happens before 1964. It happens on tracks most people have never heard of, in a state that didn't exactly have its name on the national drag racing map yet. So let's go back to Burlington, North Carolina, and figure out where this person actually came from. Burlington sits in the Piedmont region, the rolling middle section of the state between the mountains and the coast. In the late 1950s, it was a textile mill town. His father, Willard Sox Sr., ran a Sinclair gas station on Church Street, and Ronnie grew up in and around that shop, learning how mechanical things worked and, more importantly, learning how to make them work better. The family business name would end up on race cars for years. Sox's Sinclair on the door, a walking advertisement for his father's station. Here's the part about where he grew up that actually matters for this story. The area around Burlington was what people called the Whiskey Belt. This is moonshine country. The Piedmont Hills of North Carolina produced more illegal alcohol in the mid-20th century than almost anywhere else in the country, and the people who ran that whiskey needed fast cars. They needed drivers who could make a machine do things most people couldn't. The culture that produced that entire ecosystem also produced a specific kind of mechanical aptitude and a specific kind of driver. You either understood cars at a deep level or you got caught. That's the world Sox grew up adjacent to, and it shaped what he paid attention to. By the time he was a teenager, Sox had a 1932 Plymouth Coupe that his father bought him. And by all accounts, he spent enormous amounts of time with that car, practicing clutch adjustments and gear changes. Not racing yet. Just learning. Learning what a drivetrain actually felt like under his hands. How the clutch engaged. What the gear lever was communicating to him through the metal. One of his Burlington contemporaries, a man named Bud Dowdy, remembered years later that the first time he heard of Sox, it was in the late 1950s when Sox and a guy named Wink Carnes got caught street racing on Church Street. So he wasn't just sitting in the shop theorizing. He was testing what he'd learned on whatever road was available. The Police Club of Burlington started running drag races at a local airport, which is how it worked all over the rural South back then. Abandoned airstrips weren't good for much else. They were long and flat, and if you put up some timing equipment and charged admission, you had a drag strip. Sox showed up with his father's 1949 Oldsmobile Rocket 88. The Rocket 88 is historically significant for a lot of reasons, including being the car some historians credit as the beginning of the muscle car concept, but that's a different video. What matters here is that Sox showed up at that airport strip and immediately started winning. By around 1958, he got serious about it. He bought a Chevrolet with a 348 cubic inch V8, which was Chevy's big performance engine before the 409 arrived. He pulled the engine. He didn't like what the factory had done with it. He put it back together the way he thought it should be done. Changed the rear gear to a 4.56 ratio for quicker acceleration off the line and went back to the strip. The official Sox and Martin team history says he won 48 consecutive races and became the track champion. I want to be straight about something here. That 48-win figure comes from the team's own narrative, not from an independent period source I can independently verify. But every eyewitness account from that era confirms the same basic fact, which is that nobody could beat him on that strip. So the exact number might be slightly different. The fact of the dominance is pretty well established by multiple people who were there. Then, somewhere around 1960, the operation got a serious upgrade. Sox started racing a Pontiac equipped with parts from Ray Nichols Engineering out of Highland, Indiana. Now, Ray Nichols was one of the most respected performance preparation shops in the country at that time, doing work for NASCAR teams and well-funded programs with real budget. The fact that Sox was running Nichols-prepared equipment at this stage tells you something important. His reputation had grown enough to attract that kind of attention. The competition gave that Pontiac a nickname. They called it the Untouchable, which is both an excellent car name and a reasonably accurate description of what it was doing to the field on a consistent basis. This is also when Sox linked up with a Burlington businessman named Jack Ashley. Ashley was apparently successful enough to fund the operation at a higher level and sharp enough at motorsports promotion to help elevate the whole presentation. Together, Sox and Ashley reportedly won 39 out of 40 races during that stretch. The one loss in that run? No record of what happened. Some stories just have gaps like that. Anyway, they were competitive enough that they received delivery of one of the very first 1961 Pontiac Super Duty cars. The Pontiac Super Duty program was Pontiac's factory racing effort before General Motors pulled the plug on all factory motorsport involvement in 1963, and the Super Duty cars were purpose-built drag racing machines inside production-looking bodies. Getting one of the first off the line meant Pontiac knew exactly who Sox was and thought he was worth the hardware. Now, a Burlington resident named Buddy Martin had been racing his own 409 Chevrolet on the same regional circuits where Sox was competing. Martin had worked the textile mills and then the Norfolk and Western Railroad and had saved enough to buy first a 1958 Corvette and then a 409-powered Chevy. He was decent enough to be competitive at that level. But he kept running into the same problem every single weekend, which was Ronnie Socks. Martin's own quote on this became one of the most famous lines in drag racing history, and it's worth just saying it directly. He said he couldn't beat Ronnie, so he joined him. He said Socks could drive, and he knew he could pull together the deals to go racing. That's the entire partnership summarized in 2 sentences. Socks brought the talent and the reputation. Martin brought the business sense and the deal-making ability. And that business sense was not a minor detail. Martin had an instinct for how to package and present a racing team that was genuinely ahead of its time. Matching uniforms, spotless transporter, cars that looked like they belonged on a showroom floor rather than a backlot somewhere. He understood that factory sponsorship required professional presentation, not just fast quarter-mile times, and he built the team to look the part before any factory had actually signed on. That discipline would prove to be absolutely critical later. Look, at the end of 1962, Martin proposed ordering a 1963 Chevrolet Z11 427 Biscayne. These cars were extraordinary machines. General Motors built approximately 57 of them specifically for drag racing, and each one came with an aluminum block 427-inch engine rated at 430 horsepower, though that number was almost certainly conservative. The front end was aluminum to strip weight. The body panels were thin-gauge steel. Everything unnecessary was deleted at the factory level. Socks would drive it. Martin would own it. The doors said Socks's Sinclair service. The quarter panel said Friendly Chevrolet. They won their first time out in January 1963. Then in February 1963, General Motors announced it was pulling out of all factory racing support. Policy decision from the top. The GM racing withdrawal hit every team running Chevrolet, Pontiac, or any other GM brand at the time. And it left Socks and Martin holding a Z11 with no factory backing and no path forward with the people who built the car. Buddy Martin went to Detroit. He didn't come back with a Chevrolet deal. He came back with Ford. Specifically with Lincoln Mercury. And for 1964, Socks and Martin received a Mercury Comet Caliente built to factory experimental specifications. Factory experimental, or A/FX, was the NHRA class created to accommodate factory lightweight packages that couldn't compete in superstock because they were simply too radically modified to fit the existing rules. Ford had built approximately 21 of these Comets through a company called Dearborn Steel Tubing, and each one had a 427 cubic inch Ford FEV8 with fiberglass body panels, Lexan windows, a stripped interior, and the red, white, and blue paint scheme that would become synonymous with Socks and Martin for the next decade and a half. On February 16, 1964, at the NHRA Winter Nationals in Pomona, California, Ronnie Socks won the A/FX class final against Don Nicholson, who was also running a Mercury Comet. Won it on a hole shot. Socks reacted faster off the line, and Nicholson never caught up. Socks later called that first Pomona win unforgettable, and it's difficult to argue with that description. Because that win was his arrival on the national stage. Not a regional track. Not a match race on a strip nobody outside the county knew about. The Winter Nationals. The biggest event in drag racing. The team ran the match race circuit throughout 1964 and dominated it. Period accounts from that era describe Socks picking the front tires up off the ground on every gear change, which had become his visible signature on track. Just the nose of the Comet lifting on each shift, like a tell that the driver in it was doing something the car could barely contain. In the fall of that year, Socks was selected as part of a United States racing team that the NHRA organized to tour English drag strip. The team included Don Garlitz, Tommy Evo, Tony Nancy, Bill Jenkins, Ohio George Montgomery. From the Burlington Airport Strip to an international exhibition tour in approximately 6 years. That's the arc of what those regional years constructed. And here's what makes that progression remarkable when you actually sit with it. None of those national opportunities happen without the airport strip years. The technique doesn't exist without the dark road practice. The factory attention doesn't arrive without the 48 wins that built the reputation that made Ray Nichols pay attention, that made Jack Ashley see something worth funding, that made Buddy Martin decide joining was smarter than competing, that made Ford see a team worth the hardware, that put Sox on that starting line at Pomona in February 1964 with the right hands on the right shifter at the right moment in drag racing history. This is where it gets really interesting, because the Ford deal didn't get renewed for 1965. Sources don't explain this clearly, and I genuinely don't know the full reason. What I can tell you is that it turned out to be the luckiest non-renewal in the history of drag racing, because of exactly what came next. Chrysler Corporation was actively looking for talent. Specifically, Plymouth's product planning operation under a man named Bob Cahill was looking for the best 4-speed manual transmission driver in the country for their 1965 racing program. Cahill sent a former Ram Charger engineer named Dale Reeker to find whoever that was. The Ram Chargers were the famous club of Chrysler engineers who raced their own cars on weekends, whose track successes convinced the Chrysler executive suite to invest seriously in drag racing as a legitimate marketing platform. Reeker was the perfect person for the scouting assignment because he'd been inside that world for years and he understood what elite driving actually looked like, not just fast times on a scorecard but the specific combination of consistency, mechanical intuition, and raw physical ability that separated the best from everyone who was almost the best. He found Ronnie Sox. And there were multiple reasons Chrysler specifically wanted Sox rather than someone else. The 4-speed ability was the obvious one, but also his image. He was clean-cut and professional. He didn't cause problems. He didn't embarrass people in public. He spoke well at promotional events, and Buddy Martin's professional presentation of the team meant Chrysler was signing onto an operation that looked like it already belonged at factory level, not a program that needed to be built from scratch. The deal they struck was described as lucrative and long-term, and it lasted until the mid to late 1970s. There was also a strategic element to Chrysler's 1965 drag racing investment that doesn't get mentioned nearly enough. NASCAR had banned the 426 Hemi engine for the 1965 season. Chrysler responded by boycotting NASCAR entirely. All those racing dollars that had been flowing into stock car racing suddenly had nowhere to go, and Chrysler redirected them into drag racing programs with real purpose and real money behind them. Sox and Martin arrived at exactly the right moment to receive a serious portion of that redirected budget. Timing, preparation, and ability meeting at the same intersection simultaneously. Now let me tell you what Chrysler handed them for 1965. Because this is where the story becomes genuinely remarkable. The regular super stock car was a 1965 Plymouth Belvedere designated the A990, which was a factory drag racing special with a 426 race Hemi under the hood. The race Hemi had aluminum cylinder heads with a 12.5:1 compression ratio, a magnesium cross-ram intake manifold with dual Holley 4-barrel carburetors, and factory-rated horsepower of 425, which was essentially a marketing fiction. Actual output with a race Hemi in race trim was somewhere north of 500 horsepower, probably significantly north of it. The body on the A990 had been acid-dipped to reduce panel thickness until the steel panels were basically starting to become structural suggestions rather than structural members. Fiberglass hood. Fiberglass fenders. Everything they could remove, they removed. But the car that actually made history that year was the altered wheelbase version. Chrysler built approximately 12 of these total, 6 Plymouth Belvederes and 6 Dodge Coronets, and distributed them to their top factory teams. Sox and Martin got a hardtop Belvedere they called the Paper Tiger. What makes an altered wheelbase car is exactly what it sounds like. The axles are in the wrong places. Chrysler moved the rear axle 15 inches forward from its stock location and the front axle 10 inches forward. This pushed the weight distribution significantly rearward so that roughly 56% of the car's weight sat over the rear tires at launch. The body was essentially a fiberglass shell at this point. The entire body panel set for one of these cars weighed 80 pounds. Interiors gutted. Engines initially running carburetors, later converted to Hilborn mechanical fuel injection. On April 24, 1965, at York US 30 Dragway in Pennsylvania, Ronnie Sox ran 9.98 seconds at 136 miles per hour. First driver to break the 9-second barrier in a naturally aspirated door-slammer stalker on the East Coast. A production-bodied car. 9 seconds. The West Coast cars had already been there, but on the East Coast, that was the number nobody had touched. Sox got it. The NHRA banned the altered wheelbase cars almost immediately after that. They didn't fit any existing class properly, and the NHRA wasn't sure what to do with machines that were technically production cars but looked like nothing any customer could buy and ran times that embarrassed dedicated purpose-built racers. So Sox ran the Paper Tiger on the match race circuit and at NHRA events where the rules were more flexible. Crowds absolutely loved the thing. It looked genuinely strange. The nose-up stance from the altered axle positions. The wheelbase that looked wrong to anyone who knew what a Belvedere was supposed to look like. One observer described these cars as funny-looking, and that description caught on. There are several competing origin stories for the term funny car in drag racing, but the altered wheelbase Mopars from 1965 are consistently in the conversation for where the name actually came from. Now, you might be thinking that Sox and Martin were on an unstoppable trajectory at this point: factory support, record-setting runs, national attention, growing match race income. And in some ways they were. But here's what most people don't realize about the 1966 season. It introduced both the high point and an important strategic redirection that would define everything that came after. For 1966, the team built a proper funny car. A first-generation Plymouth Barracuda body on a purpose-built tube chassis fitted with a fuel-injected 426 race Hemi running nitromethane and alcohol fuel. 8 26-inch ram tubes sticking up through the hood. Headers by Doug Thorley. Somewhere around 2,200 pounds of race car capable of running in the 8.70s at over 150 miles per hour. They called it the Barracuda. On a good day, Sox reportedly won 70 out of 90 races with that machine. On a bad day, there was Don Nicholson. Nicholson had moved to a proper flip-top funny car by 1966, with a tube chassis and a full fiberglass body instead of a modified production shell. And the difference between where Nicholson was going and where Sox was positioned matters enormously here. Nicholson was evolving toward what funny cars would eventually become. Purpose-built nitro-burning machines with no connection to production vehicles except a fiberglass shell shaped to vaguely resemble one. Sox's Barracuda was still partly tethered to production thinking, and Nicholson was running in the 7s while Sox was in the 8. They added an automatic transmission to the Barracuda, which helped the consistency, but couldn't fully close the gap that the machinery difference created. Then Bob Cahill called Buddy Martin and said something that changed absolutely everything. The quote that came out of that conversation is almost perfect in its clarity. Cahill said, and I'm paraphrasing the documented account here, that the last time he checked, Chrysler didn't sell fuel-altered funny cars. Chrysler wanted its racing program to promote cars that people could actually buy at dealerships, not nitro machines with no meaningful connection to what was sitting on the showroom floor. He told Martin to put Sox back in superstock. The team complied without argument, and this redirection in 1966 turned out to be the most strategically important decision in Sox and Martin's entire history, because it aimed Sox's specific ability directly at the competitive situation where that ability mattered most. In superstock and the modified production classes that were evolving toward what would become pro stock, the driver was genuinely the variable. In a factory stock car with two competitive entries in the same class, the machinery between them was close enough that who was shifting that 4-speed was often the entire race. Sox had an advantage there that nobody could match mechanically, and Cahill's directive put him in precisely the position to maximize it. Jake King joined the team at some point in 1964 or 1965. King was from Burlington himself, ran a Gulf station on North Church Street, had been racing super stock Fords on the Southern Circuit before Martin recruited him, then went to Detroit for technical seminars on the 426 Hemi and became the team's engine builder for nearly a decade. He was so particular about his engines that he painted every Hemi block Ford blue as his personal signature, his quiet tribute to his roots in Ford racing. King's preparation work is described across multiple independent sources as a consistent horsepower advantage that the other Chrysler teams simply couldn't match on a regular basis. The talent behind the wheel and the precision under the hood, working together in the same program. Starting in 1967, Sox and Martin entered what historians of the sport would eventually recognize as their most dominant era of superstock competition. The 1967 car was a Belvedere 2 with a 426 Street Hemi that their people had modified carefully. Not the full race Hemi configuration, but a warmed-over street unit with a customized intake manifold and upgraded components that pushed it toward race specification without technically crossing the lines the rule book drew. Sox won the NHRA Spring Nationals at Bristol, Tennessee that year. He won the Super Stock and Drag Illustrated Nationals, two major national events in a single season, and this was before Pro Stock existed as a class to win. The Supercar Clinic program also launched in 1967, and this was Buddy Martin's signature business achievement. Here's the thing about the Supercar Clinics that doesn't get enough credit in the historical account. Plymouth dealers across the country wanted a tangible connection to the racing program as a marketing tool, and Martin figured out how to give it to them systematically at scale. Sox and Martin traveled to Plymouth dealerships everywhere, reportedly 265 days a year, doing demonstrations, talking about performance parts, signing autographs, being the human face of Plymouth's racing investment at the retail level where it actually moved cars off lot. Chrysler even paid for Sox and Martin to receive professional public relations and public speaking training, understanding that the program's value extended well beyond the track. The team hired Tom Richardson, who came from Hearst Performance, as drag racing's first dedicated full-time PR manager. The Supercar Clinics were the financial foundation under the entire operation, and they worked because Sox was genuinely good at this part of the job. He was approachable. He could explain what he did in terms regular people understood. He made the technology feel accessible rather than intimidating. For 1968, Chrysler built what might be the most significant factory superstock race car ever constructed. The BO-29 program, which produced the Hemi Barracuda. Plymouth built somewhere between 50 and 72 of these depending on which source you consult, with the number around 70 appearing most frequently in detailed accounts. Each one was assembled at Chrysler's Hamtramck plant, with the engines prepped at the Marysville Marine and Industrial plant, and then both were shipped to Hearst Performance in Madison Heights, Michigan for final conversion. The result was a second-generation Barracuda fastback with a 426 race Hemi, now using cast-iron heads rather than the aluminum units from the earlier cars, a comprehensive lightweight package targeting approximately 3,000 pounds, Kemker glass, thin-gauge steel, lightweight bucket seats, and a stripped interior that kept nothing that wasn't absolutely necessary. Sox and Martin received the first one off the line and debuted it at the 1968 New York Auto Show before it had ever turned a wheel in competition. That detail tells you something about how the partnership between the factory and the team actually functioned. This wasn't just a race car. It was a product announcement, and Sox and Martin were the announcement's face. In competition that year, the car was almost unfair. Sox won the NHRA Spring Nationals in Superstock, won the NHRA US Nationals in Superstock, was named NHRA Driver of the Year, won the NHRA World Championship in the class. In 1969, he came back with the same basic package and won the Spring Nationals again, which was his third consecutive Spring Nationals Superstock title. Won the U.S. Nationals Superstock class running 10.89 at 124.82 miles per hour. Won both the NHRA and HRA World Championship. World Championships, plural, in the same season. That's 6 NHRA national event wins before Pro Stock was even a class that existed to win. And the pattern is completely consistent across 3 consecutive years of national competition at the highest level of production-based drag racing. So by the time the NHRA was ready to create Pro Stock in 1970, Sox wasn't a prospect. He was the proven, documented champion of exactly the kind of racing they were formalizing into a new class structure. Let me talk about how he actually drove the car here, because this part deserves its own careful explanation, and it's the key to understanding everything. The key to understanding Ronnie Sox's competitive advantage is the Chrysler A833 4-speed manual transmission mated to a Hurst Competition Plus shifter. In Superstock and later Pro Stock, the cars were using production or near-production manual transmissions, and the driver had to actually work the clutch and shift the lever under full acceleration at wide-open throttle, while simultaneously managing reaction time and Racekraft. The technical term for what Sox did is power shifting. You don't fully disengage the clutch between gears. You release the throttle briefly while moving the lever, and the clutch just takes the load. Done correctly, you lose minimal time between gears. Done incorrectly, you miss the gear or you break something expensive. Usually both. Sox described his setup in a 1985 interview. He ran the clutch linkage very tight and used short shift levers. Tight linkage means the clutch engages very quickly after you begin releasing the pedal. Short lever means the movement required to change gears is minimal. Less travel equals less time. He had been developing the feel for exactly the right moment to engage since he was practicing on that 1932 Plymouth on Carolina roads as a teenager. This is not metaphor. This is a direct mechanical continuity between the kid learning on back roads and the man making engineers question their data. The thing that actually quantifies the advantage most clearly is what happened in 1973 when the NHRA Pro Stock rules allowed teams to switch to Lenco planetary transmissions. Lenco gearboxes are clutchless. You push a button or a lever and the transmission shifts itself through a planetary gear set. No clutch pedal. No traditional shift lever motion. Just input and change. These transmissions were engineered specifically to eliminate the human variable in gear changing and give every driver the fastest possible shift time, regardless of their individual skill level. Every driver who switched to the Lenco got faster. Some by as much as a full tenth of a second per pass. Every driver except one. Sox's car went slower when it switched to the Lenco. By approximately 0.04 of a second. The only driver in Pro Stock whose times went the wrong direction when everyone received better technology was the driver who had been beating the technology manually for years. Work backward from those numbers and what you actually get is this. Sox's human shifting was approximately 10 to 0.04 of a second per pass better than any other driver in the field. And the Lenco only closed that gap by bringing everyone else up to a level that still didn't quite match what Sox had been doing by hand all along. That's not talent in the conventional sense of the word. That's some other category of physical capability that we don't really have good language for. Buddy Martin described it the way someone who had been watching it for years would. He said Ronnie's skills as a driver were a gift. He said other drivers would miss gears left and right, and that never happened with Ronnie. He said Ronnie could get into anyone else's car and have no problems whatsoever. Bob Cahill, the Plymouth executive who recruited him, put it differently. Cahill said it was a pure joy to listen to his engines when he ran because there was no pause, no over-revving. He said Sox was so good he really didn't need a tachometer to know when to shift. That last detail, not needing a tachometer, is both accurate and genuinely staggering to sit with. A tachometer exists specifically to tell the driver when to shift, when they can't feel the engine precisely enough to know on their own. When you don't need one because you can feel the engine state with enough accuracy to know exactly when you're at the shift point, it means the information is being processed somewhere below the conscious decision-making level entirely. You're not reading a gauge and making a decision. You're shifting because your nervous system already knows, and the conscious mind is just along for the ride. Now, you might be thinking that this kind of ability either exists or it doesn't, that some people are born with it and most aren't, and that the story of how Socks developed it is interesting but ultimately secondary to the fact that he had it. Here's what most people don't realize. The ability absolutely exists on a spectrum, and where you end up on that spectrum is not fixed at birth. It's built. It's constructed through repetition at a level most people never approach, over a time frame most people never sustain, on the specific kind of machinery that demands it. The thousands of practice gear changes on a 1932 Plymouth. The airport strip sessions where consistency was the only measure that mattered. The 48 race stretch where every single run was another data point being recorded somewhere in the nervous system without the driver consciously filing it. This is where it gets really interesting, and this is the insight that changes how you understand the whole story. The Lenko data from 1973 didn't reveal a natural gift. It revealed the end product of approximately 15 years of deliberate practice at the specific physical skill that the technology was trying to replicate mechanically. The engineers weren't looking at a freak of nature. They were looking at the output of a system that had been running long enough to achieve something their machine couldn't quite match. So that's the shape of the story when you lay it out completely. A kid from a Carolina gas station who spent his teenage years practicing gear changes on whatever vehicle his father would let him near. Who showed up at an airport strip in 1958 and didn't lose for a very long time. Who ran Pontiac hardware with parts from one of the best performance shops in the country and got a nickname from the people who kept finishing behind him. Who found in Buddy Martin not just a business partner but the organizational intelligence that his driving talent needed around it to reach a national stage. Who won the first significant national event he entered, at Pomona in February 1964. And then built from that moment through Mercury and into Chrysler's factory program, and the Paper Tiger and the Supercar Clinics, and the BO-29 Barracuda dominance, and 6 national event wins before Pro Stock gave him the specific arena where his ability would become the thing drag racing history most clearly remembers. The gasser world had Ohio George Montgomery and Stone, Woods and Cook and Big John Mazmanian and Hubert Platt and Gene Cromerger. Those were the names on the modified old body cars with the nose pointed at the sky and the straight front axle and the Mooneyham blowers and the pure theater of the class. Socks was never part of that world. He was building his own thing on the production car circuit in the Carolina Piedmont at the exact same time those guys were building theirs. 2 different lineages of drag racing culture existing in parallel, developing separately, both pointing toward a future that neither had quite invented yet, and neither one fully understood the other's discipline from the outside. The legacy is documented most honestly in the numbers. 5 NHRA Pro Stock Championship. More than 46 national event wins across NHRA and HRA competition combined. Number 15 on NHRA's own ranking of the 50 greatest drivers from 1951 through 2000. First drag racers inducted into the North Carolina Motorsports Hall of Fame. Motorsports Hall of Fame of America. International Drag Racing Hall of Fame. And the 1973 Lenko data, which remains the most honest version of the legacy because it doesn't require anyone's opinion or memory or selective emphasis. Just before and after times from a technology switch that inadvertently revealed what the driver had been doing manually all along, in every race, 4 years, on a level nobody else in the class could touch. Socks died in April 2006. He was 67 years old and had been fighting prostate cancer for approximately 3 years. 1 month after he died, His widow Alicia established the Ronnie Sox Foundation to benefit St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, which tells you something real about what he thought mattered beyond the track, beyond the championships, beyond the hardware and the deals and the national event wins. Buddy Martin, by most recent accounts, is apparently still working at a car lot, still in North Carolina, still alive, which means the business half of the partnership has outlasted the driving half by close to 2 decades now. The Jim Child book from 2016 is the most complete account of the team's history and was written with the active cooperation of Martin and other people who were actually present for the events it describes. If you want the deepest available version of this story, that's where to go. The 1974 book that Sox and Martin wrote with Bill Neely, called the Sox and Martin Book of Drag Racing, is extremely scarce now, but it's the first-person account and the early years are in there. Look, what I keep coming back to with Sox is the continuity. The specific, unbroken continuity. The kid practicing clutch feel on a 1932 Plymouth on Carolina roads, and the man who outperformed a computer-controlled automatic transmission in a controlled measurement are the same person doing the same fundamental thing at different levels of refinement and in very different contexts. The airport strip wins and the Winter Nationals win and the U.S. Nationals wins and the Spring Nationals title 3 years running are all expressions of the same skill, built over the same number of years, on the same kind of machinery, through the same process of showing up and doing it again and again until the doing stopped requiring thought. It didn't appear. It wasn't discovered. It wasn't handed to him by circumstance or luck or genetics alone. It was constructed, methodically and without much fanfare, track by track and weekend by weekend and gear change by gear change, on strips that are parking lots now and roads that were never designed or intended for what he was using them for. By the time Chrysler's engineers sat with the printout that seemed to show something impossible, he had been doing it for so long and so consistently that it had stopped feeling like anything particular to him at all. It had become, in the truest sense of the word, second nature. The nature he had spent 15 years building one gear change at a time, starting on a 1932 Plymouth, before anyone outside of Burlington, North Carolina had any reason to know his name. That's the real story of Ronnie Sox. Not just the championships, not just the factory deal, not just the moments that made the headlines and the record books. The story is the years nobody photographed, the track sessions nobody officially timed, the thousands of repetitions on roads and strips that didn't have a program with his name in it. Because those years are why the rest of it happened at all. And if you understand that, you understand something about greatness in motorsport that applies well beyond one driver and one class and one era. If this kind of deep dive history is what you want more of, hit the subscribe button and stay with us. There's a lot more where this came from. This is legacy motoring.